They say blood is thicker than water. But standing in the kitchen of the Grand Belhart Hotel watching my sister's $200,000 wedding through a crack in the door, I finally understood what that phrase really means. My phone buzzed. A text from Mom. "Stay in the kitchen with the staff. This celebration is for real family only." I read it 3 times, not because I didn't understand, but because I wanted to remember this exact moment, the moment everything changed. You see, my parents had no idea who they were texting. They didn't know that every chandelier hanging in that ballroom, every champagne glass, every white rose, it all belonged to me. They thought I was the practical daughter, the forgotten one, the ATM they'd been draining for 15 years, while erasing me from every family photo. But I wasn't in that kitchen because they told me to be. I was there because it's where I chose to start. Within the hour, I would stop my own sister's wedding in front of 200 guests. My father would beg on his knees. My mother would collapse. And a single text message would become the most expensive mistake my family ever made. This is the story of how I went from the daughter they told to sit with the kitchen staff to the woman who owned the entire building. And trust me when I tell you, by the time the cake was cut, everyone in that room would know exactly who the real family was. Stay with me, because what happened next, you won't believe it until you hear it. The wedding was about to become mine. My name is Evelyn Hart, though everyone calls me Evie, and at 38 years old, I've built an empire that nobody in my family knows exists. I'm the owner of Belhart Hotels, a chain of luxury properties across the Midwest. And today I'm standing in the shadows of my own ballroom, watching my younger sister get married in a venue she has no idea belongs to me. The Grand Belhart gleams like a jewel this afternoon. Sunlight streams through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the crystal chandeliers I personally selected 3 years ago. White roses. June's favorite, though she never knew I remembered cascade from every surface. The string quartet plays Pachelbel's Canon in the corner, and 200 guests in their finest attire murmur politely as they find their seats. It's exactly the kind of wedding my parents always dreamed of. Perfect, elegant, expensive. Everything designed to show the world that the Hart family has finally arrived. I arrived early, slipping through the service entrance at 5:45. The ceremony doesn't start until 6:30, but I wanted time to observe to make sure everything was running smoothly. Old habits die hard. Even when I'm not supposed to be here, or rather even when I'm supposed to pretend I'm just another guest, I can't help but check the details. The ice sculptures are positioned correctly. The champagne is properly chilled. The waitstaff move with the practiced efficiency I've spent years training into them. I'm wearing a simple navy dress, nothing that draws attention. My hair is pulled back in a neat bun, my jewelry minimal. I learned a long time ago how to make myself invisible, how to fade into the background of my own family's celebrations. It's a skill I perfected over 3 decades of being the daughter they never quite knew what to do with. The practical one, the serious one, the one who didn't need attention because she was so capable. I'm standing near the staff corridor just outside the kitchen, watching the controlled chaos of pre-event preparation. Servers in crisp uniforms hurry past with trays of hors d'oeuvres. The catering manager barks quiet instructions into her headset. Nobody questions why I'm here. To them, I look like any other early arriving guest who wandered into the wrong area. A young woman, Maya, according to her name tag, probably 23 or 24, pauses near me with a tray of champagne flutes. She has kind eyes and a nervous energy that reminds me of myself at that age, desperate to do everything perfectly. "Ma'am, can I help you find your seat?" she asks politely. Guests aren't really supposed to be in this area. I smile at her the way I've learned to smile when I want to put someone at ease. "I'm fine here, thank you. Just getting some air before things start." She nods and continues on her way, and I feel a strange tightness in my chest. She doesn't know. None of them know. They're working in my hotel following procedures I helped establish, serving food I approved, and they have no idea that the woman in the navy dress standing by the kitchen door signs their paychecks. That's when my phone buzzes in my clutch. I pull it out, expecting maybe a last-minute detail from my assistant, or a question about one of my other properties. Instead, I see a text from the contact labeled Mom. The message is short. Brutally short. Evie, sit in the kitchen area with the staff, please. This celebration is for real family only. Don't make a scene. Love, Mom. I read it once, then again, then a third time. My hand doesn't shake. My face doesn't change. Years of practice have taught me how to absorb pain without flinching, how to swallow humiliation without showing it. But something inside me, something that's been bent and compressed for 38 years, finally snaps clean. Not with rage, not with tears, with clarity. I take a screenshot of the message, then another, just to be certain. I save them both to 3 different cloud storage systems: evidence, documentation, proof. Maya passes by again, and this time she notices my expression, or rather my careful lack of expression. "Ma'am," she says, setting down her tray, "are you all right? You look a little pale. Can I get you some water?" I look up at her, this kind young woman who's worried about a stranger's well-being, and I feel something warm cut through the cold fury settling in my chest. "I'm fine," I tell her gently, "but thank you for asking. That was kind." She smiles relieved and picks up her tray. "Okay. Well, if you need anything at all, just let any of us know. We're here to help." After she leaves, I stand there for another moment looking at my phone screen. The message glows back at me, each word a small knife. Real family only. I slip my phone back into my clutch and walk with measured steps toward the back offices. My heels click softly on the marble floor. Marble I selected myself, imported from Italy at considerable expense, because I wanted this hotel to be something extraordinary, the kind of place where people celebrated the most important moments of their lives. I reach the manager's office and knock twice before entering. Thomas looks up from his desk, his eyes widening slightly when he sees me. "Ms. Hart," he says, standing immediately. Thomas has worked with me for 8 years. He knows my voice, knows my standards, and knows better than to question my instructions. "I didn't expect to see you today. Is everything all right?" I close the door behind me and take a breath. When I speak, my voice is calm, steady. The voice of someone who built a business from nothing, who turned 3 struggling hotels into a thriving chain, who learned that real power isn't loud, it's quiet and absolute. "Thomas, I need you to do something for me. Pause all service to the VIP tables. Immediately. No food, no drinks, nothing until I say otherwise." He blinks, clearly confused. "The VIP section." But that's where the bride's family is seated. The Harts specifically requested. I know what they requested. I interrupt, keeping my tone professional but firm. "This is owner's orders, Thomas. Pause the service. Now." Understanding dawns in his eyes, followed by something that looks like concern. "Of course, Ms. Hart. Right away." As he picks up his phone to relay the instructions, I walk to the window overlooking the ballroom. From here, I can see my mother holding court near the entrance, greeting guests in a designer gown that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. My father stands beside her, chest puffed with pride. They look like the picture of success of a family that's made it. They have no idea what's about to happen. No idea that the perfect wedding they've planned, the social triumph they've orchestrated, is about to become something else entirely. I watch them smile and laugh, and I think about that text message burning in my phone. Real family only. I press my palm against the cool glass and whisper to my own reflection. They told me to sit in the kitchen, and that's exactly where I'll start. Standing at that window, watching my parents perform their roles with practiced perfection, I couldn't help but think about how we got here. The Hart family wasn't always this way, or maybe we were and I was just too young to see it clearly. We're from Indianapolis, solidly middle-class Midwest stock, the kind of family that should have been content with backyard barbecues and modest achievements. But my parents had bigger dreams, or more accurately, bigger insecurities. My father, Harold Hart, runs a mid-sized insurance firm that does well enough to keep us comfortable, but has never quite catapulted us into the social stratosphere he craves. He's 65 now, with silver hair he keeps meticulously groomed and a collection of golf club memberships he can barely afford. I've watched him my entire life chasing something he calls old money respect, that ineffable quality possessed by families whose wealth spans generations, whose names open doors without effort. He wants strangers to hear Hart and think of dynasty of legacy of belonging to something that matters. The irony is that his desperate pursuit of status is precisely what marks him as an outsider to the people he's trying to impress. My mother, Lila, came closer to that world than Dad ever did. Her family, the Ashtons, were genuinely wealthy once, not Rockefeller rich, but comfortable enough to summer in Martha's Vineyard and winter in Palm Springs. Then 2008 happened, and her father's investment firm collapsed in spectacular fashion. The money evaporated almost overnight, along with the invitations to charity galas and the respectful nods from country club staff. I was 21 when it happened, old enough to watch my mother's world crumble and see how it changed her. The loss didn't make her humble or grateful for what remained. It made her hungry, almost feral in her determination to claw her way back to relevance. Every social interaction became a calculation, every relationship a potential stepping stone. She stopped being a person and became a project manager for the family's image with my father as her willing co-conspirator. Growing up in that environment taught me early that love in the Hart household was transactional and conditional. My father had labels for both his daughter's neat little boxes that defined our worth and our roles. June was our pride and joy, introduced to business associates and friends with a hand on her shoulder and genuine warmth in his voice. I was the practical one, which sounds almost like a compliment until you hear it enough times to understand what it really means. Practical means useful but not valued. Practical means you're the daughter people call when they need something fixed, not the one they celebrate. When June got into college, Dad took out an ad in the local paper. When I graduated summa cum laude from business school, he mentioned it once at dinner, and then changed the subject to June's sorority formal. My mother's favoritism was even less subtle. She and June could spend hours together shopping, getting manicures, discussing June's social life, with the kind of engaged interest that made my chest ache with longing. I stopped trying to join those outings when I was 14, after Mom told me I wouldn't really enjoy their plans, and maybe I'd prefer to stay home and study. The message was clear. June was the daughter she wanted to be seen with, the one who reflected well on her. I was the one who made her uncomfortable, maybe because I reminded her too much of failure, of the practical necessity of working for what you have instead of having it given to you by birthright. Family photos told the story of my place in the Hart hierarchy more clearly than words ever could. For years, I didn't even notice it happening. I'd stand in the back row at reunions or off to the side at holiday gatherings, and the photographer would snap away. Later, when the photos were printed and framed, I'd find myself positioned right at the edge, easy to crop out if the frame size required it. And crop me out they did. Our living room wall is a gallery of Hart family memories, and in at least a third of them, I'm simply not there. Not because I wasn't at the event, but because someone, probably my mother, decided the composition looked better without me. More balanced. More like the family she wished she had. The unspoken rules of our household solidified as June and I grew older. Her needs came first always, and without question. If we both needed rides to different places at the same time, I was expected to take the bus. If there was money for only one daughter to attend summer camp or take music lessons, June got it without discussion. I learned to minimize my requests to make myself small and undemanding, because the few times I pushed back, the consequences were worse than just going without. My mother would get this pinched look around her eyes and say things like, "Evie, don't be selfish," or "You're older, you should understand." The implication was that needing things, wanting things, was a character flaw I needed to outgrow. The cruelest rule, the one that taught me to build walls around any sense of achievement, was that I couldn't share my successes if they might make June feel inadequate. When I won a statewide business plan competition at 17, my mother actually asked me not to mention it at June's 16th birthday party, because she didn't want to take attention away from your sister's special day. When I got promoted to regional manager at 28, making more money than my father did at that age, I made the mistake of mentioning it at Sunday dinner. The table went silent. My father cleared his throat and changed the subject. Later, my mother pulled me aside and explained that June was going through a rough patch with her job search, and it would be thoughtful of me to be more sensitive about bragging. I wasn't bragging. I was just existing, achieving, being proud of work I'd earned through 16-hour days and 7-day weeks. But in the Hart family, my pride was a weapon that hurt June, and I was expected to put it away. There was a phrase my mother used constantly, usually delivered with a tight smile and a hand on my arm, that looked affectionate, but felt like a warning. "Real family knows its place, Evelyn." She said it when I questioned why I wasn't included in a cousin's trip to Europe. She said it when I asked why June's wedding was getting a budget 10 times what mine would have been if I'd ever gotten married. She said it last Christmas when I arrived with expensive gifts for everyone, and she pulled me aside to tell me I was showing off and making your father feel inadequate. The message underneath those words was always the same. Your place is in service to this family's image, not as an equal member of it. Your place is to be grateful for being included at all, to accept whatever scraps of affection we toss your way, and to never, ever expect more. I learned my place so well that I became invisible even to myself for a while. I worked hard, achieved success, built something real and substantial, and I did it all quietly without fanfare, because that was what good, practical daughters did. They didn't make waves. They didn't demand recognition. They knew their place. Know your place, my mother had said 1,000 times, each repetition like a small stone added to a wall between us. But tonight, standing in my own hotel watching my family celebrate in a venue they didn't know belonged to me, I realized something had shifted. Tonight, I planned to redefine what place truly meant. Knowing my place also meant becoming the family's silent ATM, though they never acknowledged it as such, and I never demanded recognition. I was 24 when my father's insurance firm hit a rough patch, something about a lawsuit from a client and legal fees that threatened to sink the business. They were going to lose the house, the 4-bedroom colonial in the nice neighborhood that my mother needed to maintain her tenuous grip on respectability. I had been working for 3 years by then, living in a studio apartment and saving aggressively, because even then I understood that money meant options and options meant freedom. I had $180,000 in the bank, money I'd planned to use as a down payment on my own place someday. Instead, I wrote a check to pay off their mortgage in full. My father accepted it with a handshake and a comment about how it was the least I could do for family. My mother hugged me briefly and said I made good money, so this probably wasn't too much of a burden. Neither of them asked if I could afford it. Neither suggested paying me back even over time. The house was saved, the crisis averted, and within a week they'd moved on as if I'd simply picked up the dinner check, not handed over years of careful savings. I kept the bank statements, the canceled check, every piece of documentation. Not because I planned to use it against them, but because I needed proof, even if only for myself, that I had value beyond being practical. June's college tuition became my responsibility by default rather than by request. She wanted to go to a private liberal arts college, the kind with ivy-covered buildings and a country club atmosphere where tuition ran $45,000 a year. My parents had saved nothing. They'd spent years maintaining appearances instead of building security, and when June's acceptance letter arrived, they turned to me with expressions that managed to be both expectant and resentful. Over 4 years, I paid $180,000 for my sister's education. She graduated with a degree in art history and no job prospects, but she had the experience my mother wanted for her, complete with sorority membership and spring breaks in Cancun. I never went to her graduation, They forgot to tell me the date until it was too late to get time off work. The money didn't stop there. It never does once you establish yourself as the family safety net. Home repairs, property taxes. The country club membership my mother insisted was essential for maintaining connections. All of it somehow became my responsibility. My father would call with an emergency, his voice tight with stress, and I would transfer money. My mother would mention in passing that they were short on the tax payment and I would cover it. For 8 years, I quietly funded their lifestyle keeping spreadsheets that tracked every dollar because the businesswoman in me couldn't help but document the flow of resources. They never said thank you after the first few times. Gratitude requires acknowledging a debt, and they preferred to act as if my money simply materialized when they needed it, as natural and expected as rain. Then there was Michael. I met him when I was 28, and for the first time in my life I thought I might build something that was mine, something my family couldn't take or diminish. He was an architect, thoughtful and kind with gentle hands and a laugh that made me feel less alone. We dated for a year, and I knew he was planning to propose because he'd asked my father's permission old-fashioned in a way I found endearing. We had dinner reservations at my favorite restaurant, and I bought a new dress, allowing myself to hope that maybe I was allowed to have this one beautiful thing. He broke up with me 3 days before that reservation, sat in my living room and told me that he'd been thinking about our future and he wasn't sure I could make space for a real marriage. He said I was married to my career, that I was driven in a way that left no room for partnership, that he needed someone more present, more nurturing. The words sounded rehearsed, borrowed from someone else's mouth. I didn't cry. I thanked him for his honesty and showed him to the door, and only later did I learn the truth. My father had taken Michael aside after giving his blessing and planted seeds of doubt. Told him I was too ambitious, too focused on work, that I wouldn't make time for a husband or children. My mother had joined in suggesting that I was not the nurturing type, and maybe Michael should think carefully about whether I was really wife material. They'd poisoned my relationship because they were afraid I might move away, stop being available to fund their emergencies, stop playing my assigned role in the family structure. I never told Michael what they'd done. I let him believe his doubts were his own because explaining would have required admitting how little my own parents wanted me to be happy. The breakup cracked something open inside me, but not in the way a breakdown cracks you. It was more like a breaking through a sudden clarity about what I needed to do with my life. I was 29 years old. I'd given my family hundreds of thousands of dollars and received nothing but diminishment in return, and the one person who'd made me feel valued had been driven away by their interference. I remember sitting in my apartment the night after Michael left, looking at my bank statements and my budget spreadsheets, and thinking very clearly, if I can't earn love, I'll earn power. I threw myself into my career with single-minded intensity. I was already working in hotel management, had been since college, starting at the front desk and working my way up through sheer competence and willingness to outwork everyone around me. Now I became relentless. 70-hour weeks, 80-hour weeks. I learned every aspect of the business, from housekeeping efficiency to revenue management to guest psychology. I took classes in finance and negotiation. I cultivated relationships with investors and property owners. I made myself indispensable, then irreplaceable, then powerful. Within 3 years, I was regional director overseeing multiple properties. Within 6 years, I was being courted by ownership groups who wanted someone with my track record. And through it all, I maintained complete privacy about my success. No social media presence, no interviews in industry publications, no photographs at award ceremonies. My family knew I worked in hotels, but they had no idea I was becoming a significant player in the industry. I'd learned from them, after all, that visibility invites judgment and expectation. Better to build something real in the shadows where no one could take it or diminish it, or ask me to make it smaller to avoid making someone else feel bad. She didn't just earn power, she built an empire, and she made sure no one, not even her family, knew her name was on the deed. The empire I built started with a woman named Martha Bell, though I didn't know she would change my life the day we met. I was 26, working as an assistant manager at a struggling boutique hotel in downtown Indianapolis, when she walked through the lobby with the bearing of someone who owned the place. Which, as it turned out, she did. Martha was 68, then silver-haired and sharp-eyed, dressed in an elegant cream suit that whispered money without shouting it. She'd come to evaluate whether the property was worth keeping or should be sold off, part of her quarterly review of the 3 hotels she owned. I was the one unlucky enough to be at the front desk when she arrived, and I braced myself for the kind of inspection that usually ended with someone getting fired. Instead, she watched me handle a difficult guest, a businessman furious about a booking error that wasn't our fault. And when I'd resolved the situation with apologies and a complimentary room upgrade, she approached the desk and said something I've never forgotten. "You just turned an enemy into an evangelist. That's not customer service. That's alchemy." She asked me to give her a tour of the property, and I spent 2 hours walking her through every floor, answering her questions honestly, even when the honest answers reflected poorly on management decisions I'd had no part in making. At the end, she offered me a job as her executive assistant, with a salary that was double what I was making. When I asked why she'd chosen me, she said simply, "Because you treat people like they matter. That's rarer than you'd think, and it's the only thing that matters in this business." Working for Martha was like going to graduate school with a professor who actually cared whether you learned. She had a philosophy she repeated so often it became a mantra. Hospitality is respect in action. It wasn't about luxury or amenities or thread count, though those things mattered. It was about seeing people really seeing them and treating every interaction as an opportunity to affirm someone's dignity. She taught me that a housekeeper's insight into guest satisfaction was as valuable as a revenue report, that the night desk clerk who remembered a regular's coffee order was practicing the highest form of marketing, that culture flowed from the top, and if leadership didn't embody respect, no amount of training would create it in staff. For 5 years, she mentored me with a patience and attention my own parents had never shown. She corrected me when I was wrong, celebrated when I succeeded, and treated my growth as if it mattered to her personally. Martha became the mother I'd needed, though neither of us ever said it aloud. She invited me to her home for holidays when she learned I dreaded going back to my parents' house. She asked about my life, my dreams, my fears, and actually listened to the answers. Once, while we were reviewing financial statements in her study, I noticed her fidgeting with a gold locket she always wore. She opened it briefly, and I caught a glimpse of a baby photo before she snapped it shut. Her expression suddenly distant. "Old memories," she murmured, and changed the subject so firmly I knew not to press. I wondered sometimes about her past, about why a woman so capable of love had no children of her own, but she kept that door closed, and I respected her privacy the way she'd always respected mine. When Martha turned 73, she called me into her office and told me she'd been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's. The disease was progressing slowly, but she was a woman who planned ahead, and she'd decided to retire while she still had the clarity to make sound decisions. She wanted to sell the hotel chain, and she wanted to sell it to me. The price was $2.8 million, which was easily 30% below market value. And when I protested that I couldn't let her undervalue her life's work, she cut me off. "Evelyn, I'm not undervaluing anything. I'm investing in someone I trust to carry forward what I've built. That's worth more than money." I'd been saving aggressively, living in the same modest apartment, driving the same used car, funneling every spare dollar into investments. But I still didn't have enough for that kind of purchase. Martha connected me with investors she trusted, helped me structure a deal that was aggressive but achievable, and within 6 months the sale was complete. I bought the hotels through a limited liability company I created called Hartman Holdings, using my middle name to maintain anonymity. My family knew I worked in hotels, but they had no idea I'd transitioned from employee to owner. I told no one, signed no interviews, attended no industry events where my photograph might be taken. The anonymity was partly about privacy, but it was also about protection. I knew that if my parents discovered I owned valuable properties, they would find ways to ask for more money to position themselves as entitled to my success, to make my achievement about them somehow. I rebranded Martha's 3 hotels as Bellhart Hotels, honoring her legacy while hiding my full identity. Only lawyers and bankers knew the truth, and they were bound by confidentiality. Even Martha, as her memory began to fade, seemed to forget sometimes that she'd sold the properties to me, which broke my heart, but also freed me from having to explain my secrecy. Under my ownership, I transformed how the hotels operated, starting with how we treated our people. I implemented profit-sharing programs that gave every employee, from housekeepers to managers, a stake in our success. I created paid parental leave policies that were unheard of in the hospitality industry. I brought in mental health professionals to offer confidential counseling to staff dealing with stress or personal crises. I promoted from within whenever possible, investing in training and development, because I believed that loyalty was a two-way street. Most importantly, I maintained the culture Martha had built, the understanding that every person who worked for us deserved to be seen and valued. I continued to introduce myself to new employees as Evie from operations, letting them think I was a manager rather than the owner, because I wanted their honest feedback and their genuine reactions, not the careful performance people give to bosses they're trying to impress. What I didn't anticipate was how fiercely protective these employees would become of the company and each other. They didn't know I owned Bellhart, but they knew someone did who cared about them, and that created a bond stronger than any employment contract. Workers who felt respected became warriors for the culture we'd created. They trained new hires in the philosophy of hospitality as respect. They corrected colleagues who treated guests or each other poorly. They took pride in their work because they knew their work mattered to someone beyond just profit margins. I'd built something real, something that ran on loyalty rather than fear, and I was about to discover just how powerful that could be. Martha once told me during one of our last conversations before her memory really started to slip, "Blood isn't the only thing that runs deep, Evelyn. Loyalty runs deeper." Evie would soon learn how right she was. The loyalty Martha spoke of was tested 6 months ago when my sister called to tell me she was getting married. June was 32, still living in my parents' guest house, still floating between part-time jobs that my mother's connections secured for her. The man she'd snagged was named Caleb Morrison, and even over the phone I could hear the triumph in her voice when she described him. Venture capitalist, Harvard MBA, family money that went back 4 generations, the kind of wealth that came with a hyphenated last name and a summer house they called a cottage. My father, she said, was beside himself with joy. This was everything he'd ever wanted for the Hart family name, a connection to real power and old money, the kind of social elevation he'd spent 40 years chasing. She invited me to be a guest at the wedding, not a bridesmaid, and I accepted with the appropriate enthusiasm because that's what practical daughters do. My father threw himself into wedding planning with an intensity that would have been touching if it weren't so transparently about him. He called me 2 weeks after June's engagement not to ask how I was, or to share his happiness, but to inform me that this wedding would be a statement. He used that exact word 3 times in the 5-minute conversation. It had to be flawless, he said. Perfect venue, perfect food, perfect guest list. The Morrison family would be watching, evaluating, deciding whether the Harts were worthy of joining their circle, and there could be no mistakes, no embarrassments, nothing that suggested we were anything less than their equals. He didn't say that I was one of the potential embarrassments, but the implication hung in the air between us. The unspoken message was clear. Stay quiet, stay in the background. Don't draw attention to yourself or your accomplishments because this day belongs to June, and anything that shifts focus away from her is an act of sabotage. What my father didn't know was that his quest for the perfect venue would lead him directly to me. I learned about it when Thomas, my general manager, forwarded me a booking inquiry from a Harold Hart requesting a tour of the Grand Bell Hart for a wedding reception. I sat in my office staring at that email for a long time, feeling something cold and sharp crystallize in my chest. They were coming to my hotel, to the building I'd purchased with money I'd earned that I'd renovated with my own vision that bore my name hidden in plain sight. And they had no idea. I told Thomas to give them the full tour to offer our premium package and to send me the security footage afterward. Watching my father walk through my hotel on the security cameras was an education in restraint. He examined everything with a critical eye, running his finger along surfaces to check for dust, questioning the thread count of the linens, asking whether the chandelier crystals were real or synthetic. He negotiated hard on price, suggesting that the hotel should feel honored to host such an important event, that the social cachet of having the Morrison wedding would be worth a substantial discount. Thomas handled him with professional courtesy, neither giving ground on price nor taking offense at my father's condescension. When they finally agreed on terms, the contract went out under E. Hartman Holdings, the anonymous LLC that owned the property, and my father signed it without ever wondering who stood behind that corporate veil. I approved the contract from my office, my hand steady as I added my initials to the final page, and felt a strange sense of destiny clicking into place. But I didn't just approve their contract, I modified it. On page 12 of the standard venue agreement, buried in the dense paragraphs of terms and conditions that most people skim over, I added a special clause that my lawyer helped me word very carefully. The venue reserves the right to pause or terminate service if any member of the client's immediate family is publicly excluded from full participation in the event without documented reasonable justification. The language was deliberately vague about what constituted public exclusion and reasonable justification, which gave me latitude to interpret it however I needed to. My lawyer raised an eyebrow when I insisted on including it, but he didn't ask questions. Lawyers who work for people like me learn not to ask questions. Then I drafted a second document, a simple one-page family acknowledgement form that I'd never used before and have never used since. It stated clearly that the signing party acknowledged and confirmed that all immediate family members were invited to and welcome at the celebration, and that the family valued inclusivity and respect in this important milestone. It was positioned as a feel-good addendum, something about our hotel's commitment to family values, and I had Thomas present it to June during her final walkthrough of the venue. She signed it without reading it carefully. I later learned, chatting with her bridesmaids about flower arrangements while she scrawled her signature at the bottom. Why would she read it? It seemed like meaningless corporate paperwork, the kind of thing venues probably made everyone sign for insurance purposes or liability protection. What June didn't realize was that her signature created legal documentation that she had explicitly acknowledged me as immediate family who was invited and welcome. Combined with the service termination clause, it gave me grounds to stop their wedding if they violated the spirit of that acknowledgement. It was a trap, yes, but a fair one. A trap that would only spring if they did exactly what I'd spent 38 years watching them do, treat me as less than family while demanding I play the role when convenient. The legal architecture was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. My lawyer called it a masterpiece of strategic contract drafting. I called it insurance. The contract was signed. The trap was set. All Evie needed now was for her family to be exactly who they'd always been. The day I'd been anticipating and dreading in equal measure arrived on a Saturday in late September, one of those perfect autumn afternoons when the light turns everything golden. The Grand Bell Heart had been transformed into something from a fairy tale exactly as my sister had dreamed. 200 chairs dressed in ivory silk faced an altar constructed of white roses and delicate greenery. The crystal chandeliers I'd selected years ago caught the afternoon sun and scattered it into 1,000 tiny rainbows across the polished marble floor. June's $12,000 Vera Wang gown hung in the bridal suite upstairs, a confection of silk and lace that had required 3 fittings and my mother's constant supervision. The guest list read like a directory of Midwest high society business owners, politicians, old money families whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. This was my father's dream made manifest, his daughter marrying into the world he'd always felt excluded from, and every detail had been calibrated to prove the hearts belonged. I arrived at 5:45 using the side entrance that staff typically used for deliveries. The ceremony was scheduled for 6:30, and I'd timed my arrival to avoid the early guests and the inevitable awkwardness of greeting relatives who barely remembered my name. I wore a simple navy dress I'd bought specifically because it wouldn't photograph well, wouldn't draw attention, wouldn't give anyone reason to comment on my presence. My hair was pulled back in a plain bun, my jewelry limited to small pearl earrings that had belonged to Martha. I looked like what I'd always been in my family's eyes, presentable but forgettable, appropriate but invisible. My plan was to slip into a back row seat just before the ceremony started, stay through the reception long enough to avoid causing offense, and leave before the dancing began. I would play my assigned role one more time, the dutiful daughter who knew her place. The hotel hummed with controlled chaos as I made my way through the service corridors. Servers in crisp black and white uniforms carried trays of champagne flutes to strategic positions around the ballroom. The catering team made final adjustments to the elaborate display of hors d'oeuvres. The florist fussed over centerpieces, tweaking roses that were already perfect. Everyone moved with the practiced efficiency I'd spent years cultivating in my properties, and watching them work filled me with quiet pride. These people had no idea their boss was watching, which meant what I was seeing was genuine, the culture we'd built functioning exactly as it should without my direct oversight. I paused near the kitchen entrance, staying out of the way while taking mental notes on the flow of service. That's when my phone buzzed in my small clutch purse. I pulled it out, expecting maybe a message from Thomas about some minor operational detail, or perhaps a notification from one of my other properties. Instead, I saw a text from the contact labeled "Mom," and my stomach tightened before I even read the words. The message was brief, almost casual in its cruelty. "Evie, sit in the kitchen area with the staff, please. This celebration is for real family only. Don't make a scene. Love, Mom." She'd even added "Love, Mom" at the end, as if that softened the message, as if affection could coexist with the instruction to hide myself away like something shameful. I read it once, absorbing the words. Then I read it again, making sure I hadn't misunderstood. Then a third time, committing every character to memory, because I knew this moment would matter, that everything was about to change, and I needed to be absolutely certain of what had been said. My face didn't change. Years of practice had taught me how to receive emotional blows without flinching, how to keep my expression neutral, even when something inside me was breaking, or in this case, crystallizing into something sharp and purposeful. I was still standing there, phone in hand, when Maya appeared beside me. She was young, probably 23 or 24, one of our newer servers, who always worked with extra care because she was still proving herself. She balanced a tray of empty champagne flutes, and her face showed concern when she looked at me. "Ma'am, are you all right?" she asked, her voice gentle. "You look a little pale. Can I get you some water or help you find your seat?" I looked at this kind young woman who was worried about a stranger's well-being, who'd taken time from her duties to check on someone she thought might be in distress, and I felt a sudden fierce protectiveness toward her and everyone like her who worked in my hotels. They deserved better than to serve people who thought of them as furniture, who would relegate their own daughter to sit among them as if it were an insult. "Thank you, Maya," I said, noting her name tag and watching her eyes widen slightly that I'd used her name. "I'm fine, but I appreciate you asking. That was very kind." She smiled, reassured, and continued on her way, and I stood there for another moment, letting the full weight of what was happening settle over me. Then I moved with deliberate calm, my business mind taking over from my wounded heart. I opened my phone's camera and took a screenshot of the text message, making sure the timestamp was visible, making sure my mother's name showed clearly at the top. I took a second screenshot from a slightly different angle, backup documentation, because I never relied on a single copy of important evidence. Then I uploaded both images to 3 separate cloud storage accounts, adding timestamps and location data, creating a permanent record that couldn't be deleted or disputed. Next, I opened my contacts and called David Chen, head of security for the Grand Bell Hart. He answered on the second ring. "David, this is Evie Hart. I need you to document something for me. We may have a contract breach situation developing. I'm sending you screenshots now. Timestamp them and add them to the event file." My voice was steady, professional, the voice of an owner giving instructions to trusted staff. "Of course, Ms. Hart. Understood. Should I be concerned about a security issue?" "Not security. Legal. Just document everything from this point forward. Guest behavior, service flow, any unusual incidents. I'll explain later. I ended the call and immediately dialed Thomas. He picked up instantly, always responsive when the owner called. Thomas, I need you to pause all service to the VIP tables. Effective immediately. No food, no drinks, nothing until I give you explicit authorization to resume. There was a brief pause while he processed this highly unusual instruction. The VIP section is where the bride's family is seated. Are you certain? Owner's orders, Thomas. Pause the service now. Yes, ma'am, right away. I ended the call and slipped my phone back into my clutch. Outside in the ballroom, the celebration was beginning. Guests were arriving in their finest clothes, air-kissing, and exclaiming over the decorations. The string quartet played something classical and romantic. My mother stood near the entrance in a designer gown the color of champagne, greeting arrivals with a gracious smile that I knew was calculated to project warmth and status in equal measure. My father circulated among the early guests, shaking hands and laughing too loudly at jokes that probably weren't funny. They looked like the picture of success of a family that had finally arrived at the social level they'd always aspired to. They had no idea what was about to happen. They couldn't imagine that the daughter they'd just relegated to the kitchen was about to transform their perfect wedding into something else entirely. You wanted a perfect wedding, Evie thought, watching her mother greet guests with a champagne smile. Let's see how perfect truth looks under chandelier light. The ceremony itself went off without incident. June looking genuinely radiant as she walked down the aisle on my father's arm, Caleb waiting at the altar with an expression of such open adoration that I almost felt sorry for what was about to unfold. I sat in the back row as planned, watching my sister marry into the family my parents had always wanted for themselves, and I felt nothing but a strange, calm certainty about what would happen next. The vows were exchanged. The kiss was captured by 3 different photographers, and the newly married couple processed back down the aisle to enthusiastic applause. Then the guests moved into the ballroom for cocktail hour while the wedding party took photos, and that's when my instructions began to take effect. At 7:15, exactly 45 minutes into the reception, the whispers started. I was standing near one of the service stations, partially hidden by a decorative column, watching the room with the careful attention I'd learned from years of hotel management. The VIP tables where my parents and the Morrison family elders were seated had been receiving champagne and hors d'oeuvres for the first half hour. But now, as servers circulated through the ballroom with fresh trays of crab cakes and stuffed mushrooms, they smoothly bypassed the VIP section entirely. I watched my father's face as a server walked directly past his outstretched hand, saw confusion flicker across his features before he settled back into his chair, assuming it was a timing issue. But when the next server did the same thing, and then a third, his confusion hardened into irritation. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers at a passing waiter, a gesture that made my jaw clench because it was so perfectly my father treating service staff like they existed solely for his convenience. The waiter, a young man named Daniel who'd been with us for 2 years, stopped politely and approached the table. "Excuse me," my father said, his voice carrying that edge of authority he used when he wanted to remind people of his importance. "We've been waiting for service for quite some time. Is there some kind of problem?" Daniel's face remained professionally neutral, exactly as I'd trained all our staff to do in difficult situations. "I apologize for any inconvenience, sir. I've been instructed to pause service to this section temporarily." "Instructed by whom?" My father's voice rose slightly loud enough that nearby tables were beginning to turn and look. "We're paying a substantial amount of money for this event. I demand to know why we're being ignored." "By management, sir. I don't have any other information I'm authorized to share." I could see my father's face reddening that familiar flush that meant he was about to make a scene, and I knew it was time. I'd positioned Thomas near the entrance to the ballroom, and I caught his eye across the room and gave him a small nod. He straightened his jacket and began walking toward the VIP tables with the measured gait of someone delivering important news. Conversations around the room were starting to quiet as people sensed something unusual was happening that subtle shift in energy that occurs when a celebration's rhythm is disrupted. Thomas reached my parents' table and addressed them with perfect professional courtesy. "Mr. and Mrs. Hart, I apologize for the interruption. I'm Thomas Brennan, General Manager of the Grand Bell Hart. I wanted to inform you personally that the property owner has identified a potential breach of contract and has requested that service to the VIP section be paused until the matter can be addressed." My mother's hand went to her throat, a gesture of distress she'd always deployed when she wanted to appear fragile and victimized. "A breach of contract? That's absurd. We've done everything exactly as specified. I demand to speak to the owner immediately." "The owner anticipated that request, ma'am." Thomas turned slightly and extended his hand toward where I stood. "She's here this evening." Every eye in the ballroom followed his gesture, and I stepped out from behind the column and began walking toward my parents' table. I kept my pace measured, unhurried, giving everyone time to look at me to wonder who I was and what authority I could possibly have. The room had gone almost completely silent now, except for the string quartet, which continued playing obliviously in the corner. Phones were already coming out. I noticed peripherally guests capturing this unexpected drama for social media, or simply for their own curiosity. My father's face showed confusion, then recognition, then deeper confusion, as he tried to reconcile my presence with Thomas's statement about the owner. "Evie." He half stood from his chair, his voice uncertain. "What are you doing here? Did you complain to management about something? Is this because of your mother's text message?" I stopped 3 feet from their table, close enough to speak without shouting, but far enough to maintain a position of authority rather than intimacy. When I spoke, my voice was calm and clear, pitched to carry across the now silent ballroom. "I didn't complain to management, Dad." I paused, letting the moment stretch, watching comprehension begin to dawn in his eyes. "I am management." The confusion on his face deepened, and I saw my mother grip the edge of the table as if she needed physical support. Thomas stepped forward slightly, addressing not just my parents, but the entire room of guests, who were now watching with rapt attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, for those who don't know, allow me to introduce Ms. Evelyn Hart, owner and CEO of Bell Hart Hotels, including this property." The ballroom erupted in shocked murmurs, a wave of sound that rolled through the space as 200 guests processed what they'd just heard. I watched my parents' faces as they absorbed the information, saw my father's mouth open and close without sound, saw my mother's carefully applied makeup unable to hide the blood draining from her face. Around the room, phones were now openly filming, capturing every moment of what had become dramatically more interesting than a standard wedding reception. The Morrison family at the adjacent table sat frozen, looking between me and my parents, with expressions of deep confusion and growing concern. My father finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse and disbelieving. You own this place." I smiled, then not with warmth or with coldness, but with the absolute certainty of someone who held all the power in the room and knew exactly how to use it. Every chandelier, every contract, every clause. My father's denial came quickly, a reflexive rejection of information that didn't fit his understanding of reality. "That's impossible. We negotiated this contract with the hotel management. Someone would have told us if you were involved. This has to be some kind of mistake." I pulled my phone from my clutch and opened a secure folder, then held the screen toward him so he could see the document displayed there. E. Hartman Holdings Incorporated 8 years ago. Hartman is my middle name, Dad. The one you chose when you adopted me. Remember, the company owns this hotel and 2 others in the region. My company, my properties. My name hidden just enough that you never thought to look for it. He stared at the screen, showing the purchase agreement, the corporate documents, the property deeds, all bearing my digital signature and the company seal. His hand shook slightly as he reached toward the phone, then dropped back to his side as if touching it would make the information more real than he could handle. My mother found her voice, then slipping into the placating tone she always used when trying to smooth over uncomfortable situations. "Evie, sweetheart, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The text message I sent, I didn't mean it the way it sounded. You know how these things can come across wrong in writing. Her smile was bright and desperate, the expression of someone trying to rewrite history in real time. I looked at her directly, and something in my gaze made her smile falter. Would you like me to read the text message aloud? Mother, to everyone here. Because I have it saved, time-stamped, backed up in multiple locations. I can display it on the projection screen if you'd prefer a visual aid. The color that had drained from her face moments ago now returned in a flush of humiliation as she realized I'd documented her cruelty and was prepared to make it public. She opened her mouth to respond, but I'd already turned my attention to the broader room, addressing the guests who were watching this unfold with the kind of horrified fascination people reserve for spectacular social disasters. For those of you who don't understand what's happening, let me explain. My voice remained calm, professional, the tone I used in business negotiations when I needed to establish authority without aggression. When my father signed the contract for this venue, he agreed to certain terms and conditions. One of those conditions outlined in our dignity clause states that all clients agree to treat family members with respect and not to exclude immediate family from participation in celebrations held at our properties. I turned back to look at June, who had appeared at the ballroom entrance still in her wedding gown, her face pale with dawning comprehension. June, you also signed a document during your venue walkthrough. Do you remember a family acknowledgement form that stated all immediate family members were invited and welcome at this celebration? Is that correct? June nodded mutely, her hand gripping Caleb's arm as if she needed physical support to remain standing. Thank you for confirming that. I pulled my phone out again and opened the text message, holding it up so the people at nearby tables could see. At 6:07 this evening, I received this message from my mother. It instructs me to sit in the kitchen area with the staff because this celebration is for real family only. The gasps that went through the room were audible, a collective intake of breath as 200 people processed what I'd just revealed. Phones that had been recording casually were now held higher, more deliberately, as guests realized they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. I saw several members of the Morrison family lean together, whispering urgently, their faces showing shock and what looked like genuine dismay. I walked to Thomas, who handed me a leather portfolio he'd been holding. I opened it to reveal the contract my parents had signed, and I carried it to their table, placing it directly in front of my father with enough force that the silverware rattled. According to Section 12, Clause B, which you signed and initialed, I have the legal right to terminate this event immediately with no refund of deposits if the dignity clause is violated. My father's face went from pale to flushed, and he stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. You wouldn't dare. You'd ruin your own sister's wedding over a misunderstanding. Over a simple text message that you're taking out of context. I'm not taking anything out of context, Dad. I'm enforcing a contract that you signed. I met his eyes without blinking, without backing down. The contract you were so proud to negotiate that you told everyone was such a good deal that you signed without reading carefully because you assumed you were dealing with people less intelligent than yourself. My mother grabbed my father's arm, her voice rising to a pitch of desperation. Evie, please. Can we discuss this privately? Surely we don't need to air family business in front of all these people. I looked around the ballroom at the sea of faces at the phones recording every word, at June, standing frozen in her wedding dress, at the elaborate decorations and expensive flowers, and the wedding cake waiting to be cut. Then I looked back at my parents and saw them as they really were, small people who'd spent decades making themselves feel bigger by making me feel smaller, now faced with the consequences of their own cruelty in front of the very society they'd spent their lives trying to impress. Private discussion or public termination, I said quietly. Those are your options. I'll give you 5 minutes to decide. My father's jaw clenched, but my mother was already nodding, her hand still gripping his arm so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Private, please. We'll talk privately. I gestured toward the hallway that led to the presidential suite, the most luxurious accommodation in the hotel, the room I'd designed personally with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. This way." They followed me like condemned prisoners walking to sentencing, my father's posture rigid, with barely contained rage. My mother's heels clicking rapidly as she tried to keep up. June started to follow, but I held up a hand. "Just them, June. This is between me and our parents." Behind us, the ballroom remained frozen in shocked silence, 200 witnesses to a family's public unraveling. Thomas closed the door to the presidential suite behind us, leaving the four of us in the elegant space with its view of the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. I placed the contract on the mahogany table and pulled a pen from my jacket pocket. The termination clause was already bookmarked, requiring only my signature to nullify everything they'd planned. They followed Evie into the presidential suite. As the door closed, Harold hissed, "You wouldn't actually cancel it." Evie's pen hovered over the termination form. "Try me." My father's threat came immediately, predictably, the response of a man who'd spent his life believing that aggression could substitute for actual power. "This is extortion, Evelyn. Blackmail. I'll sue you for breach of contract, for emotional distress, for defamation. By the time my lawyers are finished with you, you'll lose everything you've built." I set the pen down deliberately and folded my hands on the table, looking at him with the patience I'd use with a child threatening to hold their breath. "You're going to sue me for enforcing a contract you violated. Please, Dad, explain to any lawyer how you plan to argue that case. You signed an agreement stating you wouldn't exclude family members. You sent a documented text message instructing me to sit with the kitchen staff because I'm not real family. That's not a legal gray area. That's a clear, provable breach." He opened his mouth to respond, but my mother cut him off, switching tactics with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime manipulating situations to her advantage. She reached across the table as if to take my hand, her voice dripping with manufactured warmth. "Evie, honey, you're being overly sensitive about this. You know I didn't mean it the way you're interpreting it. I was just trying to avoid any awkwardness, trying to make sure everyone was comfortable. You're taking this so personally when it was really about logistics." The audacity of the gaslighting would have been impressive if it weren't so infuriating. "Logistics," I repeated flatly. "Instructing your daughter to hide in the kitchen is logistics. You know what I mean. Don't twist my words. Then let's stop twisting words entirely." I stood, and the shift in physical position made both my parents lean back slightly in their chairs. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk back into that ballroom in front of all those guests and their phones, and you're going to say publicly that I am your family and I am welcome here. Not grudgingly, not with qualifications. A clear, unambiguous statement that family deserves respect." My father's face flushed dark red, the vein in his temple throbbing visibly. "Absolutely not. We will not be humiliated in front of the Morrisons and everyone we know. This is our daughter's wedding day, and you're trying to make it about you and your hurt feelings." My hurt feelings. I let the words hang in the air between us. 38 years of being told I don't matter, that I'm not really family, that I should be grateful for scraps of attention. And you think this is about hurt feelings? My mother's voice took on a desperate edge, the manipulation giving way to something more raw. "What do you want from us, Evelyn? You want us to grovel, to admit we're terrible parents in front of everyone who matters? You want to destroy us?" "I want you to tell the truth." I picked up the pen again, positioned it over the signature line. "Or I terminate this contract and everyone goes home. June doesn't get her fairy tale wedding. The Morrisons see exactly what kind of family they're marrying into. And all those society friends you're so desperate to impress get to witness the consequences of treating your own daughter like garbage." The door to the suite burst open and June rushed in, still in her wedding gown, her face blotchy with tears, mascara leaving dark tracks down her cheeks. "Please," she sobbed, looking between me and our parents. "Please, Evie. It's my wedding day. I know Mom was wrong. I know they've been awful to you, but please don't do this. Not today." Looking at my sister, genuinely distraught in her expensive gown, I felt something twist in my chest, but I didn't lower the pen. "This isn't about you, June. This is about mom and dad deciding whether their pride is worth more than their daughter's celebration. "We're not apologizing," my father said through clenched teeth. "We will not be publicly humiliated." I nodded once, then signed my name on the termination form with deliberate strokes. "Then we're done here." I walked toward the door, the signed document in my hand, and I heard my mother make a strangled sound of protest. June called my name, her voice breaking, but I kept walking. I'd given them a choice, and they'd made it. Their pride mattered more than June's wedding, more than our family, more than any relationship we might have salvaged from the wreckage of the past 38 years. As I reached for the door handle, June's scream cut through the room like breaking glass. "Stop!" I paused, hand on the handle, and turned back to see June with her hand over her mouth, eyes wide with horror at what she'd just witnessed. My parents sat frozen at the table, my father's face rigid with stubborn anger, my mother's crumpling as she realized I'd actually done it. "I gave you a choice," I said quietly. "You chose pride over family. Now everyone gets to live with that decision." I walked out of the presidential suite and back toward the ballroom where 200 guests waited in suspended animation. Thomas met me in the hallway, his expression carefully neutral. "The full termination?" he asked quietly. "Not yet." I handed him the signed form, but without the final page that would make it official. "I want them to see what this looks like first. Dim the chandeliers to half. Stop the music. Have all service staff freeze in position until I give the next instruction." Thomas nodded and spoke quietly into his radio. I walked to the ballroom entrance and stepped inside, and every head turned toward me. The whispers that had been building died instantly. I didn't say anything, just gave Thomas a small nod. The crystal chandeliers that had been blazing with light began to dim slowly enough that it felt deliberate rather than like a power failure. The string quartet's music faded mid-phrase and stopped. Around the room, servers who'd been moving between tables froze in place like living statues, some with trays held at shoulder height, others caught mid-step. The effect was surreal, almost theatrical, transforming the celebration into a frozen tableau. Every person in that room understood instantly this was not a technical malfunction. This was a demonstration of control. Everything in this building, from the lights to the music to the people serving champagne, moved at my command or not at all. The ballroom fell silent, 200 guests holding their breath. Then the double doors opened. June stepped out, still in her wedding gown, mascara streaked down her face. June walked to the center of the ballroom, her wedding gown rustling in the unnatural silence, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the frozen scene with startling clarity. "I need to say something, and I need everyone here to hear it." She turned slowly, looking at the guests at the phones, still recording at Caleb standing near the head table with an expression of complete confusion. Then she looked at me. I knew Evie owned this hotel. The gasps that rippled through the crowd were audible even over the crushing silence. I felt my own breath catch, not expecting this confession, not from June, not now. 3 weeks ago. She continued, her voice shaking but determined. Mom was Googling the hotel trying to find contact information for some detail about the flowers. She found the corporate registry, found E. Hartman Holdings, and she figured it out. She called me immediately and told me Evie was the owner. June's hands twisted in the fabric of her gown, wringing the expensive silk. She made me promise not to tell anyone. Not Dad, not Caleb, not any of our family. She said if Dad found out, he'd cancel the wedding out of pride, that he'd rather have no wedding than one where Evie had any power over us. My mother had emerged from the presidential suite and stood near the entrance, her face ashen, but she didn't deny it. June saw her, and something in my sister's expression hardened. I went along with it because I was scared. Scared of disappointing them, scared of losing my perfect day, scared of having to choose between my sister and my parents. Her voice broke on the word sister. When I signed that family acknowledgement form during the venue tour, the one that said all immediate family were invited and welcome, I knew exactly what I was signing. I read it, and I signed it anyway, telling myself that you'd understand, Evie. Because you always understand. You always step aside. You always make yourself smaller so the rest of us can be comfortable." She walked toward me, tears streaming freely now, and I saw in her face something I'd never seen before, genuine remorse mixed with self-loathing. "I've been a coward my whole life. I let them treat you like you didn't matter because it was easier than standing up for you. Because standing up for you might mean they'd stop loving me, and I couldn't risk that. I chose their approval over your dignity every single time." We stood 3 feet apart, my sister in her fairy tale dress, and me in my forgettable navy, and the years stretched between us like a chasm. Years of her getting everything while I got nothing. Years of me paying for her life while she never asked where the money came from. Years of me being cropped out of photos while she smiled in the center. But looking at her now, seeing real recognition of what she'd done written across her tear-stained face, I felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the possibility of it somewhere down a long road. "I'm sorry," June whispered, and it sounded like she meant it. "I'm so sorry." Before I could respond, movement near the back of the ballroom caught my attention. A woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and an elegant burgundy dress was making her way through the crowd. It took me a moment to recognize her as Diane Crawford, the wedding planner June had hired, but as she got closer, something familiar in her face made my breath catch. "Diane," I said uncertainly, because I knew her from somewhere, knew her from before, but my mind couldn't quite place where. She reached me and took my hands in hers, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Hello, Evie. It's been 15 years. I wasn't sure you'd remember me." Then it clicked. The small hotel where I'd worked at 23, just after my parents had thrown me out for reasons they never fully explained. The front desk manager who'd found me sleeping in my car in the employee parking lot and had given me a key to the storage room, let me shower in the employee facilities, brought me leftovers from the hotel restaurant until I could afford food again. Diane had been more than kind. She'd been a lifeline when I had nothing. "You saved my life," I said quietly. "I never forgot that. And I never forgot you." She glanced toward where my father stood near the presidential suite entrance, his face rigid with poorly concealed rage. When Harold Hart contacted me 6 months ago to plan his daughter's wedding, I almost turned him down. But then he mentioned the venue was Bell Hart Hotels, and he made an unusual request. He asked me to keep an eye on his other daughter, Evelyn, in case she tried to cause any problems. He wanted me to report back to him about anything you said or did. I felt ice forming in my chest. Even my father's choice of wedding planner had been about controlling me, about making sure I stayed in my assigned place. "I took the job to protect you, not betray you," Diane continued. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small wooden box, old and worn, and pressed it into my hands. "I've been documenting things for years, Evie. Ever since Harold found out I'd helped you and tried to get me fired from every hotel job I applied to. I started keeping records then. Photos, emails, proof of what he's done." My hands trembled as I held the box, almost afraid to open it, afraid of what proof of my father's cruelty might look like in concrete form. Diane's voice softened. "I couldn't give this to you before because I didn't know if you were ready to see it. But tonight, watching you stand up for yourself, I think you're ready for the truth." I lifted the lid. Inside were photographs paper-clipped to printed emails, bank statements highlighted in yellow handwritten notes in my father's distinctive scrawl. The top photo showed my father and Michael, my ex-fiancé, sitting together in a coffee shop, their heads bent close in conversation. The date stamp on the photo was from 9 years ago, 3 days before Michael had broken up with me. Beneath it was an email thread where my father offered to help cover some of Michael's student loans if he reconsidered his engagement plans. Another document showed my father contacting the board of a hotel where I'd applied for a director position, claiming I had emotional instability issues that made me unsuitable for leadership. The evidence went on, a paper trail of sabotage spanning 15 years. My father hadn't just been emotionally cruel, he'd actively worked to destroy opportunities, relationships, any chance I had at building a life that didn't revolve around serving the family's needs. June had moved closer, looking over my shoulder at the contents of the box, and I heard her sharp intake of breath as she recognized what she was seeing. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Evie, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know he'd done these things." I looked up from the box, my vision blurring slightly with tears I refused to let fall, and met my sister's horrified gaze. "What does it say?" June whispered, her voice barely audible. I pulled out a bank statement from the bottom of the box, one dated from 3 months ago, showing a wire transfer I'd sent with the memo line, "For June's wedding expenses." My voice came out flat, stripped of emotion, because if I let any feeling in, I'd shatter completely. "It says they never told you about my $50,000 wedding gift." June stared at the bank statement in my hand, her face going from confusion to comprehension to horror in the space of 3 heartbeats. $50,000, Evie. I never received any money from you. I don't understand." I looked past her to where Thomas stood near the audio-visual control panel we used for wedding presentations. "Thomas, can you display my phone screen on the projection system?" He nodded, and within seconds had connected my phone to the large screen that had been set up for the couple's photo slideshow. I opened my banking application, navigated to my transaction history, and found the entry I needed. The date, March 15th, appeared in crisp digital font, followed by the transaction details that I'd reviewed a dozen times since sending it, always wondering why June had never acknowledged the gift. "Wire transfer?" I read aloud, my voice carrying across the still-frozen ballroom where 200 guests stood transfixed by the unfolding drama. $50,000. Recipient Harold Hart. Memo, for June's wedding expenses. Confirmation number, routing information, everything documented and processed through my bank. The projection screen displayed the evidence in letters large enough for everyone to see. June's gasp was audible, her hand flying to her mouth as she turned to look at our father. "Dad, you received $50,000 from Evie for my wedding." My father's face had gone a mottled red, and white patches of color appearing and disappearing as his blood pressure spiked. "There must be some mistake. I don't recall any such transaction. Perhaps it went to the wrong account, a banking error of some kind." "There was no error." The voice came from near the back of the ballroom, and I recognized it immediately. Richard Chen, my personal accountant for the past 6 years, was making his way through the crowd. I'd invited him to the wedding not as my +1, but as insurance, knowing that if I needed to prove financial claims, having my accountant present would be invaluable. He carried a leather portfolio, and his expression was professionally neutral, but I could see the anger in the set of his jaw. "Mr. Chen?" I said, gesturing him forward. "Would you please explain to everyone what documentation you have regarding this transaction?" Richard opened his portfolio and extracted several pages, holding them up so the guests near him could see. "I personally processed this wire transfer on March 15th at Ms. Hart's request. The receiving account belonged to Harold Hart, verified through multiple security checks. 3 days later, Mr. Hart visited his bank and signed a receipt acknowledging the deposit of $50,000 into his personal checking account." He pulled out another document. "I have a copy of that signed receipt obtained through standard financial documentation procedures." June had pulled out her phone and was frantically scrolling through something. "Caleb and I have a joint account specifically for wedding expenses. Every deposit, every payment, it's all tracked there. There's no $50,000 deposit. There's nothing even close to that amount." Caleb, who had been standing silent and increasingly distressed throughout all of this, moved to look at June's phone screen, and then up at my father with an expression of dawning disgust. "Sir, where did that money go? If Evie sent it for the wedding and it never reached our account, what happened to it?" My father's bluster returned, defensive and aggressive. "This is absurd. I don't have to explain our private financial arrangements to a ballroom full of strangers. If there was a banking error or a miscommunication about accounts, that's between Evie and me." "Then let's talk about all the other financial arrangements," Richard said, his voice cutting through my father's protests with professional precision. Since Ms. Hart has given me permission to disclose this information, I'd like to share some context." He pulled out a spreadsheet, and Thomas, understanding what was needed, displayed it on the projection screen. Over the past 14 years, Ms. Hart has transferred a total of $380,000 to her parents. The number appeared on the screen in stark black and white, and I heard the collective intake of breath from the assembled guests. Richard continued, his voice steady and factual. $180,000 in 2012 to pay off the family home mortgage. $180,000 over 4 years for college tuition payments made directly to the university on behalf of June Hart. The remaining $20,000 in various transfers for home repairs, property tax payments, and country club membership fees. June had gone completely pale, her hand gripping Caleb's arm so tightly I could see her knuckles whitening. "You paid for my entire college education, Evie. I thought Mom and Dad paid for that. They never told me." "They never told me thank you either," I said quietly. Not once in 14 years did they acknowledge what I'd given them, except to imply that I was selfish for not giving more. Richard flipped to another page in his portfolio. "Ms. Hart has never been listed in family Christmas cards despite funding the family's lifestyle. She was not invited to graduation celebrations for June Hart despite paying the tuition. She was not acknowledged at family gatherings despite being the reason the family home wasn't foreclosed on. The pattern of financial exploitation combined with social exclusion is extensively documented." My mother, who had been standing frozen near the presidential suite entrance, suddenly broke. Her carefully maintained composure shattered, and words poured out in a desperate rush. "We needed that money. Harold's business was failing. We were drowning in debt. We would have lost everything. You were making good money. You didn't have children to support. You could afford it. What were we supposed to do? Lose our home? Lose our standing in the community? You were supposed to ask honestly," I said, and my voice was quiet, but it carried across the ballroom with perfect clarity. "You were supposed to treat me like family instead of an ATM. You were supposed to say thank you. You were supposed to not tell me I was selfish while you were stealing from me." The word stealing hung in the air, and I saw several guests nodding their expressions, showing sympathy not for my parents, but for me. An older woman near the front, someone I recognized as a member of the Morrison family, had tears streaming down her face. A man in an expensive suit was shaking his head slowly, his mouth set in a grim line of disapproval. My father made one last attempt at salvage, his voice rising in indignation. "We didn't steal anything. That money was family. Helping family. You benefited from having a stable family home from your sister getting a good education. This is how families work." I walked toward him slowly, deliberately, my heels clicking on the marble floor in the silence, and when I stood directly in front of him, I met his eyes without blinking. The projection screen behind me still showed the spreadsheet of my financial transfers, the evidence of 14 years of one-sided generosity that had never been reciprocated or acknowledged. I turned to my father, my voice steady as stone. "You didn't lose the check, Dad. You lost something far more valuable." I paused, letting the moment stretch, letting the weight of what I was about to say settle over the room. "You lost my trust, and now the whole world knows it." My father's face twisted with a mixture of rage and desperation, and he jabbed his finger toward me with a violence that made several nearby guests flinch. "If you're so righteous, Evelyn, if you think you have the moral high ground here, then read that text message to everyone. Go ahead. Let all these people judge whether a simple request from a mother to her daughter constitutes the crime you're making it out to be." He thought he was calling my bluff, thought that exposing the words publicly would somehow diminish their cruelty, make them seem reasonable in the cold light of social scrutiny. He'd miscalculated badly. I pulled my phone from my clutch, opened the message, and my voice carried across the ballroom with perfect clarity. "Text message received today at 6:07 p.m. from Mom." I read slowly, letting each word land with its full weight. "Evie, sit in the kitchen area with the staff, please. This celebration is for real family only. Don't make a scene. Love, Mom." The eruption of reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps of genuine shock, murmurs of disbelief, and above it all the voice of an elderly woman seated near the front. Someone I recognized as Mrs. Eleanor Morrison Caleb's grandmother, and a woman whose family name carried significant social weight. She stood, her voice shaking with what sounded like genuine outrage. "You told your own daughter she isn't family, that she should sit in the kitchen like hired help." Mrs. Morrison's hand trembled as she pointed at my mother. "That's not just cruel, Mrs. Hart. That's monstrous." Other voices joined hers, a chorus of condemnation from people who'd come to celebrate, but were now bearing witness to something far darker. I saw heads shaking, saw women dabbing at their eyes, saw men whose faces had hardened with the particular anger that comes from watching someone abuse power over someone vulnerable. My parents had wanted a wedding that would cement their social standing, and instead they were watching that standing crumble in real time. My mother's face had gone from flushed to ashen, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the way blood drained from her cheeks as the full weight of public judgment crashed down on her. She made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and clutched at her chest as if the shame were a physical thing crushing her lungs. Then she turned and began rushing toward the exit, her heels clicking frantically on the marble floor as she fled from the ballroom and the eyes of 200 people who now saw her exactly as she was. She made it perhaps 20 feet before she stumbled. Her hand reached for the doorframe but missed, and I watched in what felt like slow motion as her face went from pale to gray as her knees buckled as she collapsed to the floor in a heap of champagne-colored silk. June's scream cut through the room like a blade. "Mom!" I was running before I consciously decided to move my body, reacting with an instinct that had nothing to do with the past hour's revelations, and everything to do with the fact that she was still my mother, still the woman who'd raised me, even if that raising had been twisted and damaging. I reached her side just as June did, both of us dropping to our knees beside her crumpled form. My mother's eyes were open but unfocused, her breathing rapid and shallow. "Someone call an ambulance," I shouted, but a calm voice behind me said, "I'm a doctor." I turned to see Dr. Anjali Patel, a cardiologist I recognized, because she and her husband were on the guest list kneeling beside us with the practiced calm of someone accustomed to emergencies. "Let me examine her. Everyone please give us space." The crowd pulled back, and Dr. Patel's hands moved efficiently, checking pulse, looking at my mother's eyes, asking questions in a low voice that my mother answered in weak murmurs. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 minutes, Dr. Patel looked up at June and me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "She's stable, but I need to speak with family members privately. Is there a quiet room nearby?" Thomas appeared beside us, ever efficient. "The presidential suite, Dr. Patel. This way." Between the 4 of us, we helped my mother to her feet and guided her to the suite she'd left just minutes before, though it felt like hours had passed. My father followed his earlier bluster, completely deflated, replaced by what looked like genuine fear. Once the door closed behind us, Dr. Patel turned to my mother with an expression that was both compassionate and stern. "Mrs. Hart, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer honestly. Have you been undergoing treatment for cancer?" The question hit the room like a bomb. June gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My father's face went blank with shock. But my mother's reaction told me everything I needed to know even before she spoke. Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded a small, defeated movement. "How did you know?" she whispered. "I recognized you from the oncology center," Dr. Patel said gently. "I do consulting work there. I've seen you in the waiting room. What you just experienced wasn't a heart attack, but it was a stress-induced episode that's dangerous for someone undergoing chemotherapy. Does your family know about your diagnosis?" My mother shook her head, tears streaming down her face, now cutting tracks through her makeup. "No one knows. I didn't want anyone to know." "Mom," June's voice broke on the word. "You have cancer for how long?" 6 months, early-stage lymphoma. The prognosis is good, they caught it early, but the treatment—" She looked at June with an expression of desperate pleading. I didn't want to be pitied. I didn't want your wedding overshadowed by people feeling sorry for me. I wanted this day to be perfect for you, wanted to give you this one beautiful thing before everything became about hospitals and sickness and fear. I stood there feeling like the floor had shifted beneath me, like everything I thought I understood about this confrontation had suddenly become more complicated. My mother had been cruel, had been systematically awful to me for years, had sent that text message knowing exactly how much it would hurt. But she'd also been facing her own mortality in secret, carrying the weight of a cancer diagnosis alone while trying to orchestrate the perfect wedding for her younger daughter. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it added a dimension of human frailty that made my anger feel suddenly too simple, too clean. "You should have told us," I heard myself saying, my voice hoarse. "We could have helped. We should have known." "I didn't want help," she said, looking at me directly for the first time in what felt like years. "I wanted control. I wanted to give June this perfect day before I lost the ability to control anything about my life." Dr. Patel excused herself to give us privacy, and the four of us sat in that elegant suite in crushing silence, the sounds of the confused wedding reception filtering through the door like echoes from another world. I felt tears threatening for the first time all night. Not tears of anger, but of something more complicated, grief maybe, or exhaustion, or the terrible realization that even the people who hurt us most are still just broken humans trying to survive their own pain. I needed air, needed space to think. I stood and walked to the door, mumbling something about needing a moment, and stepped into the hallway where the lighting was softer and I could breathe. Alone in the corridor, I reached into my jacket pocket for a tissue, and my fingers brushed against paper I'd forgotten was there. An envelope old and slightly yellowed that I'd carried with me for months without opening. Martha had given it to me a year before her Alzheimer's had progressed too far for her to write coherently, had pressed it into my hands and said, "Read this when you need it most." I'd never felt ready to read it until now. My hands shook as I carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside, written in Martha's elegant script. The first line blurred through my tears, but I read it anyway, and it felt like she was speaking directly to this moment, to this exact, crushing complexity. "Forgiveness is the final ownership of peace." I stood in the hallway clutching Martha's letter, her words about forgiveness blurring through tears I'd been holding back all evening, and I realized I couldn't face the ballroom yet. I needed a moment away from the cameras and the judgment and the complicated tangle of anger and guilt that my mother's diagnosis had created. My feet carried me through the service corridors, almost automatically following paths I'd walked hundreds of times during venue inspections, until I found myself pushing through the swinging doors into the kitchen. The kitchen was controlled chaos, as it always was during large events. Steam rose from industrial stoves, plates clattered as they were assembled with precision, and the air smelled of roasted chicken and herbs and the chocolate ganache that would top the wedding cake. But when I stepped inside, something shifted. The staff nearest the door looked up and saw my face, saw whatever raw emotion I was failing to hide, and within seconds, word spread through the kitchen in whispers and meaningful glances. Rosa Martinez, our head cook, who'd been with the hotel for 12 years, wiped her hands on her apron and crossed to where I stood, frozen just inside the doorway. She was 63, a grandmother from El Salvador who ran her kitchen with fierce efficiency and fiercer love, and she took one look at me and said, "Mija, sit down before you fall down." I let her guide me to a stool near the prep station, and suddenly I was surrounded by women who'd spent the evening serving my family's wedding. Maya, the young server who'd checked on me earlier, appeared with a cup of tea. Carmen, who managed our housekeeping staff, pulled up another stool beside me. Within minutes, a dozen women had formed a loose circle around me. These women who cleaned rooms and cooked food and carried trays, who I'd tried to build a workplace family with, but who I'd never expected would claim me as their own. "We heard what happened out there," Rosa said, gently pressing the warm tea into my hands. "We heard what your mother said to you, what you did about it. You showed them dignity when they showed you none. Now you need to show yourself the same." I tried to speak, but my throat closed around the words. These women had witnessed my humiliation, had heard me called not real family by my own mother, and yet they were the ones surrounding me now with tea and concern and presence. The symmetry of it hit me with crushing force. My mother had told me to sit in the kitchen because I wasn't family, and now the kitchen was where family had gathered around me. "I don't know what to do," I finally managed to say. "My mother's sick. She has cancer. I didn't know, and now I feel like everything I just did was cruel, like I punished her for being human and scared." Rosa exchanged glances with several of the other women, then settled onto a stool across from me. "May I tell you something, Hija? My mother, she was not a kind woman. She loved me, I think, but she loved her anger more. When she got sick, I took care of her because that's what you do. But taking care of someone doesn't mean pretending they never hurt you. Your mother's sickness doesn't erase 38 years of making you feel small." Carmen, whose English carried a thick Russian accent, spoke up quietly. "In my country, we say hurt people hurt people. Your mother is hurt, yes, but you are also hurt. Both things true at same time." Maya, the youngest of the group, looked at me with eyes that reminded me uncomfortably of myself at her age. "Ms. Hart, when you trained me, you said the most important thing we do here is make people feel seen. You've spent your whole life trying to be seen by your family. Maybe it's okay to stop trying now." Rosa stood and held out her hands. "I want to pray for you if that's okay, and if anyone else wants to join, you're welcome." I nodded, not trusting my voice, and Rosa began speaking in Spanish words I only partially understood, but whose meaning came through in her tone. Then Carmen added prayers in Russian, and Maya spoke quietly in English about peace and healing, and another woman I recognized as Fatima from our maintenance staff murmured something in Arabic. They were Christian and Muslim and Jewish, and probably some who believed in nothing formal at all. But they formed a circle of prayer around me with their different languages, creating a tapestry of sound that felt more holy than any church service I'd attended. I cried, then really cried, not the dignified tears of someone in control, but the ugly sobbing of someone who'd been holding themselves together through sheer force of will and had finally found a safe place to fall apart. These women, who my mother would never have considered real family, held that space for me without judgment or expectation. When the tears finally subsided and I could breathe again, I stood on shaky legs and looked at each of them in turn. "Thank you, all of you. I don't know what I did to deserve this kind of loyalty, but thank you." "You saw us," Rosa said simply. "You treated us like we matter. That's what you did." I wiped my eyes, straightened my shoulders, and felt something settle in my chest. A decision. A path forward that felt right even though it wasn't simple. "I need to go back out there. And I need you to resume full service. Serve the dinner, serve the cake. June and Caleb deserve to have their celebration." The women exchanged uncertain glances. Maya voiced what several of them were clearly thinking. "But after what your parents did, don't they deserve to have the wedding ruined?" "The truth is already out there," I said, my voice steadying. 200 people with phones recorded everything. By tomorrow, everyone in our social circle will know what happened. That's punishment enough. The real statement isn't canceling the wedding. It's showing that even after being treated like I don't matter, I can still choose grace over vengeance. Rosa studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're stronger than your parents ever understood." "Okay, mija. We serve the dinner. But what about after? What happens when dessert is finished?" I thought about Martha's letter still clutched in my hand about forgiveness being the final ownership of peace, and about the box of evidence Diane had given me showing 15 years of my father's systematic sabotage. I thought about my mother sitting in the presidential suite with a cancer diagnosis she'd hidden because she couldn't bear to show weakness, and about June standing in her wedding gown finally understanding the cost of her complicity. There was more truth to be told, more reckoning to be had, but it could wait until after my sister had her wedding dinner. "After dessert," I said quietly, "there's one more truth that needs to be served. But June gets to cut her cake first." The kitchen staff dispersed back to their stations, the temporary pause transforming back into efficient motion as dishes were plated and trays were loaded. I watched them work for a moment. These women who'd surrounded me with prayer and tea when I needed it most, and felt grateful in a way that had nothing to do with business ownership, and everything to do with being seen as fully human. I straightened my dress, took a deep breath, and walked back toward the ballroom entrance where Thomas waited with a question in his eyes. I gave him a small nod. "Serve dessert," I told the staff quietly, my voice carrying just enough to reach the servers gathered nearby. "And then serve the reckoning." The dinner service resumed, with practiced efficiency servers moving through the ballroom carrying plates of herb-crusted chicken and roasted vegetables, while guests ate with an awkwardness that comes from trying to make small talk after witnessing a family's spectacular implosion. My parents had returned to their table, sitting stiffly and avoiding eye contact with anyone, while June and Caleb attempted to salvage some semblance of normalcy at the head table. As dessert was being plated in the kitchen, I gave Thomas a signal, and the lights in the ballroom began to dim, as if for a traditional toast. The large projection screen that had displayed my banking records earlier flickered to life again, and I watched my father's face tighten with what looked like dread about what might come next. Thomas took the microphone with his usual professional polish. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we serve dessert, we'd like to share something special about this evening's celebration. Tonight's event has been made possible in part by the Bell Heart Foundation for Family Dignity, a charitable organization dedicated to supporting workers who face family estrangement and financial abuse." The screen displayed an elegant logo I'd designed 2 years ago, the words Bell Heart Foundation, arched over an image of clasped hands. Beneath it appeared the text, "Founded by Evelyn M. Hart in honor of Martha Bell." Thomas continued reading from notes I'd prepared months ago, never imagining they'd be delivered under these circumstances. "Ms. Hart has personally donated over $2 million to provide counseling services, emergency housing, and job training for individuals rebuilding their lives after family rejection. To date, the foundation has served over 300 people across the Midwest." The applause started slowly, then built as guests rose to their feet, and I watched my mother's face cycle through emotions too quickly to track. Horror that I was being lauded as a philanthropist while she'd just been exposed as cruel. Confusion about how I'd hidden such massive charitable giving. And something that might have been grudging respect, though it was hard to tell through her obvious distress. The Morrison family's matriarch was nodding approvingly, and I could see other society figures whispering to each other with expressions that suggested I'd just elevated my social standing considerably while my parents had cratered. But I wasn't finished. As the applause died down, the screen changed to display an old photograph slightly faded with age. It showed a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and Martha's unmistakable smile holding a newborn baby wrapped in a blanket embroidered with the name Evelyn in delicate script. The caption appeared, "Martha Bell, 1987. The murmuring started immediately. Then another image appeared, a legal document with official seals and signatures. Adoption agreement, Evelyn Sarah Bell. Biological mother Sarah Bell deceased. Legal guardian Martha Bell. Adoptive parents Harold and Lila Hart." I walked to the center of the ballroom and took the microphone from Thomas. My voice was steady, though my hands trembled slightly. My biological mother Sarah Bell was Martha's younger sister. She died giving birth to me. Martha wanted to raise me herself, but she was unmarried and building her business, and in 1987, that made single parenthood nearly impossible for a woman trying to be taken seriously in the hotel industry. I paused, letting that information settle. So Martha made an arrangement. She paid Harold and Lila Hart $50,000 to adopt me with a contract that stipulated I would be loved equally, given equal opportunities, and treated with the respect any child deserves. My father had gone completely still, his face a mask that revealed nothing. My mother's hand covered her mouth. June was crying silently, Caleb's arm around her shoulders. For the first few years they kept that promise. But when I turned 8 and started bringing home straight A's and winning academic competitions, something changed. They became afraid I'd discover the truth about my adoption and claim Martha's inheritance. So they did what frightened small people do. They tried to break my spirit before I could discover my worth. I held up my phone showing screenshots of emails I'd found in Martha's files 6 months ago when her lawyers had given me access to her estate papers as her Alzheimer's progressed. I only learned all of this recently when Martha's condition triggered a truth protocol written into her will. Every scholarship I thought I'd earned, Martha funded it. Every lucky break in my career, Martha made a phone call. The adoption contract forbade her from telling me the truth until I turned 30, or until my adoptive parents violated the terms of our agreement. Harold stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. "We gave you a home, we raised you, we fulfilled our obligations. You cashed Martha's checks," I said, my voice cutting across his protests. "Martha raised me through letters she sent to my college address that you never knew about, through surprise visits to my first apartment that you weren't invited to, through love you never thought to give because you were too busy resenting the obligation I represented." June's voice was small and broken. "So you were never really my sister?" The question pierced something in my chest, and my voice cracked for the first time all evening. "I was June. I wanted to be. You just never treated me like one." Harold stood, his face twisted with rage and humiliation, and he pointed at me with a shaking finger. "You'll regret digging all this up. You think you've won something here. You've just destroyed this family." The ballroom held its breath, 200 people frozen in their seats, watching this confrontation unfold. Somewhere in the crowd I could see phone screens glowing as they captured every word. And I noticed something Harold hadn't: the small wireless microphone sitting on the groom's table left on from when Caleb had given his earlier speech, was positioned directly in line with where Harold was standing. My father turned away from me and walked back toward his table, where my mother sat pale and shaken. He leaned down close to her, clearly believing that the distance and the ambient noise of 200 people would give them privacy for a whispered conversation. What he didn't realize, what he'd completely forgotten in his anger, was that the microphone on the groom's table was still live and positioned at exactly the right angle to catch his words. His voice boomed through the speaker system with perfect, devastating clarity. "She was never ours, Lila. She was just a paycheck. Martha's money kept us afloat for years, and now she's using it all against us like we're criminals for taking what we were offered." The ballroom went dead silent. Not the tense silence of people waiting to see what happens next, but the absolute vacuum of sound that comes when everyone stops breathing at once. My father straightened up, confusion crossing his face as he registered the expressions of horror on the faces around him, and then understanding dawned as he realized what he'd just done. His face went from red to white in the span of a heartbeat. I could see phones throughout the room, dozens of them all recording. The moment was being captured from every angle, and I knew that within hours, it would be everywhere. Harold, heart pillar of the community, admitting on a hot mic at his own daughter's wedding that he'd viewed his adopted child as nothing more than a financial transaction. The social death I'd witnessed beginning earlier was now complete and irrevocable. Mrs. Morrison stood slowly, her elegant frame radiating the kind of moral authority that comes from generations of breeding and genuine character combined. Her voice carried across the silent ballroom with icy precision. "Mr. Hart, your behavior is reprehensible. I want you to know that the Morrison family does not and will not associate with people who exploit children for profit. You have shown us exactly who you are, and I believe you." Other guests nodded in agreement, and I watched my parents' social circle crumble in real time as the people they'd spent decades trying to impress turned away from them with expressions of disgust. But I wasn't finished. There was one more truth that needed to be served, one more consequence of their own actions that they needed to face. I walked calmly to the center of the room and took the microphone back from Thomas. "Since we're discussing money and what people are owed, let me share something else." I gestured to the projection screen, which now displayed a program from a charity gala held 3 months earlier. At the Metropolitan Children's Fund benefit in June, my father participated in an auction. The item he won was described as an evening of hospitality with the Hart family, with the venue to be determined by the event organizer. He bid $50,000. The screen showed the auction listing in clear detail, including my father's signature on the winning bid form. I could see him starting to understand where this was going, could see the color draining from his face again. The winning bid, I continued, my voice steady, was placed by a proxy acting on behalf of the Bell Heart Foundation, which, as we've established, I control. I let that sink in for a moment. The contract Mr. Hart signed stipulates that the venue and guest list would be determined by the foundation. I've chosen the Bell Heart Community Kitchen, and the guests will be 50 women from our homeless services program. Next Saturday at 6 p.m. Mr. Hart will be serving them dinner personally. My father found his voice, though it came out strangled. I never agreed to that. That's not what the auction was supposed to be. A man in an expensive suit stood near the back of the room, and I recognized him as Peter Walsh, the lawyer who'd helped me structure the foundation. Actually, Mr. Hart, if you'll check the contract you signed, it specifically states venue and attendees to be determined solely by the organizing charity. You waived any right to approve or veto those decisions when you signed. Refusal to honor the commitment at this point would constitute charity fraud, which carries both civil and criminal penalties. The trap had sprung perfectly, and I watched my father realize he'd been caught by his own pride, his own need to be seen as generous and important enough to make grand gestures at charity auctions. The guests were beginning to applaud, first tentatively, and then with genuine enthusiasm, and I could see people pulling out their phones to check social media, where I knew this was already exploding. Someone near the front was showing their screen to the person next to them, and I caught a glimpse of a hashtag #KitchenJustice. My father stood frozen, his face a mask of humiliation and rage, and I could see the exact moment he understood the full scope of what had happened. He'd lost the moral high ground. He'd lost his reputation in front of everyone who mattered to him socially. He'd lost the respect of the Morrison family, and with it probably any hope of maintaining close ties with his new son-in-law's influential circle. And it had all been captured on dozens of phones, would be shared thousands of times, would follow him for the rest of his life. The perfect wedding he'd orchestrated to showcase the Hart family legacy had instead become the public documentation of his own moral bankruptcy. I set down the microphone and looked at my father across the distance of the ballroom, across the chasm of 38 years of hurt and revelation. You wanted a perfect wedding to show off your family legacy. Congratulations, Dad. The whole world is watching it now. The ballroom remained frozen in shocked silence, my father standing exposed and humiliated, the hot mic moment already spreading across social media like wildfire. I looked around at the 200 guests, at June crying in her wedding gown, at Caleb looking lost and overwhelmed. And I made a decision that surprised even myself. I gestured to Thomas, who understood immediately, and began moving through the staff with quiet instructions. Within moments, servers who had been standing frozen resumed their choreographed movements. The DJ, who'd been waiting nervously by his equipment, started the music again, something soft and romantic that filled the uncomfortable silence. I walked to the center of the ballroom and addressed the guests one final time. Tonight is supposed to be about June and Caleb's love, about two people starting their life together. I won't let family dysfunction ruin that for them. I turned to look at my sister, tears streaming down her face. June, I'm sorry this happened on your wedding day. You deserve better than this. Everyone, please enjoy the rest of the evening. The cake cutting will proceed as planned. The applause that followed was different from before, warmer, somehow tinged with respect rather than just shock. June ran toward me, her elaborate gown rustling, and threw her arms around me in a hug that felt genuine for the first time I could remember. She sobbed against my shoulder, her carefully styled hair coming loose, her makeup ruined, but her embrace was real. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for being better than all of us." Guests began standing, the atmosphere shifting from horror show back toward celebration, though the energy was subdued and strange. People approached June and Caleb with congratulations, carefully avoiding my parents who sat isolated at their table like pariahs. I saw Mrs. Morrison speak briefly with Caleb, her hand on his shoulder in what looked like reassurance, and I was grateful that at least June's new family seemed inclined toward grace. My mother had remained seated through all of this, her face gray, and her breathing still labored from the earlier collapse. Dr. Patel had returned to check on her, and now 2 staff members were helping her stand to take her to a private room for rest. As they guided her past the head table, her oversized designer purse slipped from her weakened grip and hit the floor with a heavy thud. The contents scattered across the marble lipstick compact phone and a thick manila envelope that June instinctively bent to retrieve. "Don't," my mother said weakly, reaching for it, but June had already picked it up. The envelope was sealed but had June's name written across it in my mother's distinctive handwriting. June looked at it, then at our mother, and something in her expression hardened. She tore open the seal despite my mother's protests, and I watched her face change as she processed what she was seeing. She pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills counted quickly, her lips moving silently. Then she extracted a handwritten note on my mother's personal stationery. "Read it," and her face went from confusion to horror to rage in the space of seconds. Without a word, she handed me both the money and the note. The note was dated 3 days ago, written in my mother's careful script. "My darling June, this is an emergency fund. If that sister of yours tries anything to disrupt your wedding, use this money to hire someone to remove her or discredit her immediately. I've included cards for private investigators and crisis management attorneys who specialize in handling difficult family members discreetly. Do not let her ruin your perfect day. Use whatever means necessary. Love, Mom." Clipped to the note were business cards for 2 private investigators and a lawyer whose website I later learned specialized in restraining orders and reputation management. $10,000 in cash for the specific purpose of destroying me if I stepped out of line. Not a contingency plan made in panic, but a premeditated strategy written 3 days before the wedding. June's voice when she spoke was shaking with fury. "You were planning to have her thrown out, to hire people to discredit her, maybe even have her falsely arrested." My mother, still weak and pale, tried to salvage it. "I was protecting you, June, protecting our family's image. I knew she might try something and I wanted you to have options if she did." "She is our family." June's shout cut across the resumed music and conversation, drawing attention from nearby tables. "She's been more family to me than you ever were, and I was too blind and selfish to see it." She turned to me, tears streaming fresh. "Evie, I'm so sorry. For everything. For every time I let them treat you like you didn't matter, for every time I took what you gave without asking where it came from, for signing that acknowledgement form and staying silent about you owning this hotel." The nearby guests had gone quiet again, watching this new revelation unfold. June took my hand, her grip tight and desperate. "Please stay. Please don't leave. I know I don't deserve it, but please stay for the whole reception. You should have been at this table from the beginning." She gestured to the head table where Caleb sat with his groomsmen, and before I could respond, June was pulling me toward it. She literally gave me her seat, the bride's seat, positioned me next to Caleb, and took a chair that someone quickly brought from another table. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone watching. The sister who'd been told to sit in the kitchen was now seated in the place of honor. Caleb leaned over and spoke quietly. "I'm sorry for what my family is marrying into, but I'm grateful for who June is marrying out of. Thank you for giving us this evening back." The reception continued around us, surreal and strange, but continuing nonetheless. Cake was cut and served toasts were made that carefully avoided mentioning my parents. And June and Caleb had their first dance while I sat at the head table feeling like I was watching someone else's life unfold. My parents left early, slipping out a side door without saying goodbye to anyone, and their absence made the room feel lighter somehow, like a pressure had been released. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, many stopped by the head table to speak with me. Some offered apologies for not recognizing what was happening sooner. Others thanked me for the foundation's work. Mrs. Morrison clasped my hand and said simply, "You have more grace than most people will ever understand." I sat at that head table surrounded by June's friends and Caleb's family and felt the strange cognitive dissonance of being both triumphant and heartbroken. I'd proven my worth, exposed my parents' cruelty, and reclaimed my dignity. But I'd also blown up what remained of my family and even justified rage leaves scars. As the wedding reception continued, Evie sat at the head table for the first time in her life. But the story doesn't end with reconciliation. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived from Martha's estate attorneys. 3 days after the wedding, I was sitting in my office at the Grand Bell Hart going through the mountain of paperwork that had accumulated during my absence when my assistant buzzed to tell me someone from Whitmore and Associates was in the lobby with a delivery that required my signature. Whitmore and Associates was the law firm that had handled Martha's estate planning, and my heart immediately began racing. I told her to send them up. The attorney was a woman in her 50s named Patricia Whitmore, who I'd met once before during the initial reading of Martha's will. She carried a sealed package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string old-fashioned in a way that was quintessentially Martha. Patricia's expression was kind but professional as she placed it on my desk. Ms. Hart, I'm required to inform you that this package was to be delivered only under specific conditions outlined in Ms. Bell's estate instructions. Those conditions have now been met. She slid a document across the desk for me to review. The trigger was explicit. The package could only be released after you publicly confronted your adoptive family regarding their treatment of you. The incident at your sister's wedding made national news. Several board members of the foundation saw the coverage and contacted our office to confirm the conditions had been satisfied. My hands trembled as I signed the receipt. Patricia offered a small sympathetic smile. Ms. Bell was very specific about the timing. She wanted you to have this after you'd found your own strength, not before. I'll leave you to open it privately. She left quietly, closing the door behind her, and I sat staring at the package for a long moment before carefully unwrapping it. Inside was a mahogany box polished to a deep shine with a small brass plate engraved with my name. I opened it to find a USB drive nestled in velvet, along with a handwritten note in Martha's elegant script. Watch this alone, my darling girl. Then decide what kind of woman you want to be. My laptop was already open on my desk, and with shaking hands I inserted the drive and clicked on the single video file. Martha appeared on screen sitting in the study of her home that I remembered so well. The video was dated 5 years ago, before her Alzheimer's had progressed, when her eyes were still sharp and clear. She wore a cream cardigan and her signature pearl necklace, and when she spoke, her voice was strong and steady. Hello, my darling girl. If you're watching this, it means you finally stood up for yourself. It means you confronted Harold and Lila about how they treated you, and you did it publicly enough that my attorneys knew about it. I'm so proud of you, Evelyn. So very proud. Tears were already streaming down my face, but I couldn't look away from the screen. Martha leaned forward slightly, her expression intense with love and conviction. I need to tell you something that you've probably already figured out, but that I was never allowed to say while I was still myself. I've watched you from afar for 20 years. I knew everything Harold did. I knew he sabotaged your engagement with Michael, offering him money to walk away. I knew he called your potential employers with lies about your character. I knew he stole the money you sent for June's wedding. I knew Lila erased you from family photos and told people you were too busy with work to attend family events. I knew, and I documented everything, and I wanted to intervene 1,000 times. She paused, and I could see moisture in her eyes. But I couldn't. If I had rescued you, swooped in, and saved you from them, you would have spent your whole life wondering if you were capable of standing on your own. You would have seen yourself as a victim who needed saving, and that would have been its own kind of prison. I had to let you find your own strength, had to trust that the woman I helped raise would eventually recognize her own worth without needing me to validate it. I was sobbing now, understanding flooding through me with painful clarity. Every time I'd felt alone, every time I'd wondered why Martha didn't do more to help me, she'd been making an impossible choice between protecting me and allowing me to become strong enough to protect myself. Martha's image on the screen smiled sad, but certain. I'm leaving you everything, Evelyn. $8.2 million in properties, investments, and liquid assets. It's yours with only one condition: use it to restore dignity, not destroy blood. I don't want you to use this money to punish Harold and Lila. They'll punish themselves far more effectively than you ever could. Instead, I want you to use it to help other people who feel invisible, who've been told they don't matter, who need to know that family is something you build through love and respect, not something you're trapped in by biology. She leaned back in her chair, her expression softening. I didn't save you, Evelyn. I just gave you the tools, the intelligence you inherited from your mother, Sarah, the business sense I taught you, the financial foundation to build something real. But you saved yourself. You turned pain into power rejection, into resilience exclusion, into empire. And I hope you'll use that strength now to save others who feel the way you once did. Martha's face filled the screen, and her final words were spoken with such tenderness that I felt them physically like a hand on my shoulder. I love you, my brave girl. I've always loved you. From the moment Sarah placed you in my arms and took her last breath, I loved you. Not telling you the truth for 30 years was the hardest thing I ever did, but watching you become the woman you are today made every moment of silence worth it. Be magnificent, Evelyn. You already are. The video ended with Martha smiling, and the screen froze on that image. I sat in my office with tears streaming down my face, understanding finally settling into place like the last piece of a complex puzzle. My confrontation with my parents at the wedding hadn't been about revenge, though it had felt like that in the moment. It had been about reclaiming my worth, about refusing to accept their definition of who I was supposed to be. The anger I'd felt, the calculated exposure of their cruelty, had been necessary for my own liberation. But Martha was right. The real power wasn't in destroying them. It was in building something better. I wiped my tears and smiled at the frozen image of Martha on screen, her face warm with love and pride for a woman she'd never gotten to see become. Maybe the best revenge, I whispered, is grace with a backbone. I watched Martha's final message 3 more times that afternoon, each viewing revealing new layers of love and strategy in her words. By the time I finally closed my laptop, I felt both lighter and more purposeful than I had in years. Martha had given me not just her estate, but permission to move forward without the weight of vengeance dragging me down. I spent the rest of the week working on foundation initiatives, deliberately not thinking about my parents, or checking social media to see how the wedding videos were spreading. Then, exactly 1 week after the wedding, my father called me. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. His voice on the line was different from any tone I'd heard from him before. Not angry, not imperious, but bewildered and almost frightened. Evelyn, I need to talk to you about something that's been happening. He paused, and I could hear my mother's voice in the background, sharp and insistent. We've been trying to go to our regular restaurants this week, and we keep being told there are no tables available. But we can see empty tables. Tonight at Marcello's, where we've had a standing reservation for 15 years, the maitre d' claimed they were fully booked even though the dining room was half empty. I said nothing, letting the silence stretch, and he continued with increasing desperation. It's happened at the country club at Giovanni's at the steakhouse on 5th Street. Even the golf club denied us a tea time yesterday, claiming the course was overbooked, but when I drove by there were only 3 groups playing. Something is going on, and I think you need to call these people off. I haven't called anyone, Dad. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play games with me, Evelyn. You own hotels, you have connections in the service industry. You must have put out some kind of word about us. Before I could respond, my phone beeped with another incoming call. I glanced at the screen and saw it was Marco Rossi, owner of Bella Notte, a mid-range Italian restaurant I'd worked with occasionally for foundation events. Dad, I have another call. I'll talk to you later. I switched lines. Marco, this is Evie. Ms. Hart. I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to give you a heads up about something. Your father and mother just left my restaurant. They tried to get a table and I told them we were booked, but that wasn't true. I need you to know why. My stomach tightened. Go on. Two of my line cooks used to work at Bellhart Properties. They saw the videos from the wedding, recognized your parents, and came to me with the entire kitchen staff this morning. They presented me with a petition signed by every single person who works in my kitchen and most of my front-of-house staff. It said they refuse to serve customers who exploit and abuse workers, and that if I insisted on serving your parents, they would all quit effective immediately. I was genuinely shocked. Marco, I had no idea this was happening. I never asked anyone to— I know you didn't, he interrupted gently. That's why I'm calling. This isn't coming from you. This is coming from us, from the people who work in kitchens and dining rooms and hotels across this city. We talk to each other, Ms. Hart. We share stories about which customers treat us like human beings and which ones treat us like furniture. Your parents have a reputation that goes back years. The wedding just made it public. He paused, and I could hear kitchen noise in the background. Here's the thing, what my staff is doing isn't illegal. We have the right to refuse service to individuals who have documented patterns of abusing service workers. It's not discrimination based on a protected class. It's an ethical stance based on observed behavior. And from what I'm hearing, staffs at about a dozen other establishments have made the same decision independently. After I hung up with Marco, I sat in stunned silence for several minutes before my phone rang again. My father calling back. This time I let it ring 4 times before answering. Evelyn, please. Whatever you've done, whatever you've told people, please just make it stop. Your mother can't leave the house without people staring at her. We can't go anywhere. We're being shut out of everything. I took a deep breath, thinking about Martha's words about grace and dignity. Dad, I need you to hear me very carefully. I didn't tell anyone to do anything. I haven't made a single phone call, sent a single email, or had a single conversation asking people to refuse you service. What's happening is that the people you've spent decades treating as invisible have decided they don't want to serve you anymore. They made that choice themselves. That's impossible. How would they all even know? Because service workers talk to each other. I said, my voice getting colder despite my intention to stay calm. They remember the customer who snaps his fingers at waiters. They remember the woman who sends food back 3 times just to feel powerful. They remember the people who tip poorly and complain loudly and treat them like their existence doesn't matter. You thought those people didn't count, that their opinions were irrelevant because they were just doing their jobs. Turns out their opinions matter quite a lot when they decide collectively that they'd rather lose your business than lose their dignity. So you're saying you won't help us? You're just going to let this continue? I'm saying I can't help you even if I wanted to. You wanted respect through wealth and status. Dad, you spent your whole life trying to buy your way into social circles that would validate your importance. These people are showing you that respect is earned through character, not purchased with money. They're teaching you a lesson I learned a long time ago. How you treat people when they can't fight back says everything about who you really are. The line went quiet for a long moment. Then my father's voice came back, smaller than I'd ever heard it. The videos from the wedding are everywhere. The hot mic moment. Your mother being told to sit in the kitchen. All of it. We've been uninvited from the Harrison Charity Gala next month. The church asked us to take a break from volunteering. Even the book club told your mother they're full and can't accept new members, which doesn't even make sense. I felt a pang of something not quite sympathy, but an acknowledgement of their humanity, even in their cruelty. They were facing complete social exile, the thing they'd feared most their entire lives, and it was happening not because of legal consequences or financial ruin, but because they'd been revealed as exactly who they were. I'm sorry you're going through this, I said, and I meant it. But I can't fix it for you. The only people who can change this situation are you and Mom, by becoming the kind of people others want to be around. That's going to take time and genuine change, not apologies made for strategic purposes. Harold hung up the phone and looked at Lila. Both of them sitting in their expensive home with nowhere to go and no one to see them. "What have we done?" Lila whispered. Harold had no answer. 2 weeks passed in a strange limbo where I threw myself into foundation work and tried not to think about the fact that my parents were living in a self-imposed exile of their own making. Then a letter arrived at my office delivered by regular mail in an envelope addressed in handwriting I recognized despite not having seen it directed at me in over 20 years. My father's distinctive slanted script, the same handwriting that had signed checks and business contracts, but had never written me a birthday card or a note of encouragement. Inside was a single page also handwritten, and the vulnerability of that choice using pen and paper instead of typed formality made my hands shake slightly as I unfolded it. Evelyn. It began, not Dear Evelyn or any other softening prefix, just my name stark and alone. I need to speak with you before it's too late. I'm asking for an hour of your time not because I deserve it, but because there are things I need to say while I still can. Please. Your father, Harold. I read it 3 times looking for manipulation or strategy, but all I found was exhaustion and something that might have been genuine desperation. I called the number he'd included at the bottom and agreed to meet him the following afternoon at the Bellhart in a small conference room we called the family room because it was designed for intimate gatherings rather than business meetings. The irony of the location wasn't lost on either of us. He arrived exactly on time and I barely recognized him. In 2 weeks, my father seemed to have aged a decade. His face was gaunt, his expensive suit hanging loose on a frame that had lost weight, and his eyes had a hollowness I'd never seen before. He sat across from me at the small table, his hands folded in front of him like a penitent, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. "Thank you for seeing me," he finally said, his voice rough. "I wasn't sure you would." I almost didn't. I kept my tone neutral, professional. "You said you needed to tell me something before it's too late. What does that mean?" He looked down at his hands, and when he spoke the words came slowly, like each one cost him something. "I loved Martha Bell once, before I met your mother. We were young and she was magnificent even then. Brilliant and kind and so far out of my league it was almost laughable. But she saw something in me, or at least I thought she did. We dated for about 6 months before she ended. It said she needed to focus on her career, and I needed to figure out who I was beyond trying to impress people. This was information I'd never had a piece of history that reframed everything. Mom knows this. Your mother has always known. It's part of why—" He stopped, gathered himself. "When Martha came to me 20 years later with the proposal to adopt you, I saw it as a chance to stay connected to her world, to that money, to the life I'd always wanted but never achieved. I told myself I was helping her, giving you a stable home. But the truth is, I saw you as an investment, a way to maintain a relationship with Martha and her resources." The honesty was startling, almost brutal. I sat perfectly still, letting him continue. "Your mother grew jealous. She saw you as Martha's spy in our home, a constant reminder of my past feelings for another woman. And I let her poison my mind against you because it was easier than standing up to her, easier than admitting that I'd taken you in for the wrong reasons." He looked up at me, and his eyes were wet. "I sabotaged your engagement with Michael because I was afraid you'd move away and Martha would stop sending money. I stole the wedding check because my business was failing and I was desperate. I excluded you from family events because keeping you diminished made me feel less guilty about using you. I ruined 2 women's lives, both called heart. You and your mother, who I turned into someone she never should have been." I let the silence stretch after he finished processing this confession that was more complete than anything I'd expected. Finally, I spoke. "I don't need your apology, Dad. Apologies are words, and words are what you've always been good at when you needed something. What I need is action. Tell me what you want. I'll do anything." I pulled out a folder I'd prepared just in case this meeting went this direction, though part of me hadn't believed it would. Mom needs to write a formal public apology to every staff member at Bellhart Hotels that she's disrespected over the years. We have a list. She needs to sign it, and it needs to be displayed in our employee areas. In exchange, I'll continue covering her cancer treatment costs and connect her with the best oncologists in the state." Harold nodded, his throat working. "Done. What else?" You volunteer at the Bell Heart Community Kitchen every Sunday for the next year. Not writing checks, not making appearances, actual work. Serving meals, cleaning tables, washing dishes. You fulfill that charity auction commitment you tried to avoid every single week. I'll do it. Both of you attend family therapy, not couples counseling for your marriage, but therapy focused on understanding the damage you've done and learning how to rebuild relationships based on respect rather than obligation. I'll pay for it, but you have to actually participate, not just show up. His hands were shaking now. Agreed. And we're establishing a fund in Mom's name, the Lila Grace Fund for cancer patients from working-class families who can't afford treatment. You'll both be publicly associated with it, which means you'll have to show your faces at fundraisers and events where people will remember what you did. You'll have to earn back your reputation through consistent action over time, not grand gestures. Evelyn, I'm not finished. I slid a contract across the table. My lawyer drafted this. It includes everything I just said, plus a clause that if either of you violates these terms or publicly disparages me, June or the foundation, you forfeit any claim to the Hart family name in social settings and agree to financial penalties. This isn't about revenge anymore, Dad. It's about accountability and boundaries. He picked up the contract with trembling hands and read through it slowly. When he finished, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. This is more than fair. It's more than I deserve. Yes, it is. I met his eyes directly. I'm not doing this because I forgive you. I'm doing this because Martha taught me that grace isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It's about choosing peace over poison. You have 1 year to prove you can change. If you do, maybe we can rebuild something that resembles a family. If you don't, we're done forever. No second chances after this. He signed the contract, his signature shaky but legible, and I witnessed it before making a copy for him. As he stood to leave, tears were streaming down his face openly. That's more than I deserve, he repeated. Yes, I said quietly. It is. Don't waste it. Harold left the hotel with the signed agreement clutched in his hand like a lifeline. I watched him go, then turned off the lights in the family room. We've finally cleaned the mess, I whispered to the empty space. But my phone rang, shattering the moment of peace. June's name flashed on the screen, and when I answered, her voice was frantic and frightened. Evie, something's happened. My heart jumped into my throat. June, what happened? Are you okay? Is it Mom? No, everyone's fine. I mean physically fine. Her voice was thick with tears breaking on every other word. I can't do this anymore, Evie. I can't pretend everything is fine while you carry all this weight alone. Caleb and I were supposed to leave for our honeymoon tomorrow to Bali, and I was packing and I just started crying and couldn't stop. I sat back down in the family room, relief and confusion mixing together. June, slow down. Tell me what you need. I need to help. We're postponing the honeymoon. Caleb agrees, he actually suggested it first. We want to work with the foundation, do something useful instead of just posting beach photos while you're here dealing with the wreckage of our family. The offer surprised me enough that I didn't immediately know how to respond. June continued before I could find words. And I need to apologize. Really apologize, not just to you, but to everyone at the hotel who had to witness that disaster. Can you introduce me to your staff? I want to look them in the eye and tell them I'm sorry for being part of a family that treated people so badly. 2 days later, I brought June to the Grand Bell Heart during the afternoon lull between lunch and dinner service. We gathered the staff who'd worked the wedding in one of the private dining rooms, about 20 people ranging from servers to kitchen staff to the housekeeping team who'd prepared the venue. June stood in front of them looking nervous in jeans and a simple blouse, more casual than I'd ever seen her dress in public. I don't have a speech prepared, she began, her voice shaking. I just need you all to know that I'm ashamed of what you witnessed at my wedding. I'm ashamed that I stayed silent while my parents treated my sister like she didn't matter. I'm ashamed that I signed that form acknowledging Evie as family while knowing my mother planned to exclude her. She looked at Maya, the young server who'd been so kind to me. I'm sorry you saw me at my worst. I want to learn how to be better, and I'm hoping some of you might be willing to teach me." The room was silent for a moment. Then Rosa, the head cook, stood up. "You come to my kitchen, mija. You want to learn, I'll teach you. But you work, you don't watch. You understand?" June nodded, tears streaming. "I understand. Thank you." Over the following week, June showed up at the hotel every day working shifts alongside the staff. She started in Rosa's kitchen doing prep work, moved to housekeeping, to learn how to properly clean a room, spent time at the front desk, handling difficult guests. Caleb joined her, both of them working without pay, learning the business from the ground up. One evening, June approached me with a proposal that made my chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Evie, I know you have properties in smaller cities. Caleb and I want to manage one of them, not as owners, not as your sister getting a favor, but as actual workers. I've never had a real job in my life. I've never earned anything that wasn't handed to me. I need to understand what you built and why it matters." I studied her carefully, looking for signs of performative guilt or temporary enthusiasm that would fade. "This isn't a hobby, June. It's long hours, difficult guests, staff problems, budget constraints. It's work that will make you tired and frustrated, and sometimes question why you're doing it." "I know." Her eyes were clear and steady. "That's exactly why I need to do it." That night, June and I sat in my apartment with takeout Chinese food and talked for hours in a way we never had before. She told me about growing up feeling the weight of being the perfect daughter, how every achievement felt hollow because she knew it was gifted rather than earned. I told her about the loneliness of being the practical one, how I'd learned to make myself small to avoid making her feel diminished. We cried together over the family we should have had, and slowly began sketching the outlines of what we might be able to build. From that conversation, an idea emerged. We developed a new foundation program called the Second Families Initiative, designed to help young adults estranged from biological families build chosen family networks. June became the public face of it, sharing her own story of complicity and change in ways that were raw and honest. She used her social media following and society connections not for lifestyle content, but to fundraise and raise awareness, bringing in donors who'd never heard of the foundation before. At the end of our planning session, as June was leaving my apartment, she hugged me with an intensity that felt different from the desperate embrace at her wedding. This was steadier, more grounded. "Thank you for not giving up on me," she whispered. "Thank you for showing me it's never too late to become who you should have been." I hugged her back, feeling something that had been broken between us beginning to knit together in a new configuration. Not the sisters we'd been forced to be by birth and circumstance, but the sisters we were choosing to become. Maybe real family can be rebuilt one honest conversation at a time. I was reviewing foundation grant applications the following week when my assistant buzzed to tell me there was an elderly woman in the lobby who'd traveled from across the city specifically to see me. She wouldn't give her name but insisted it was about my father. My first instinct was to refuse. I'd had enough of my parents' drama for a lifetime, but something in my assistant's tone suggested this was different. The woman who appeared in my office doorway was small and dignified, probably 70 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and weathered hands that spoke of decades of hard work. She carried herself with a quiet strength that reminded me of the kitchen staff who'd prayed for me. "Ms. Hart, thank you for seeing me. My name is Rosa Mendez. I was your family's housekeeper many years ago before you were born. I saw the news about your wedding, all those videos online, and I couldn't sleep. I had to come tell you something about your father that you need to know." I gestured for her to sit, curiosity overriding my wariness. Rosa settled into the chair across from my desk and pulled a worn photograph from her purse. "This was taken 41 years ago. That's my son Carlos, and that's your father." The photo showed a young man I barely recognized as Harold, maybe 24 or 25, sitting on a porch step with a boy of about 7. They were both holding children's books, and my father's face showed an expression I'd never seen on him: genuine warmth, unguarded joy. The boy was looking up at him with obvious adoration. Your father taught Carlos to read English, Rosa said softly. Every Saturday morning for 2 years, he would sit with him and go through books patient as anything. Carlos struggled with learning and the schools weren't kind to immigrant children back then. But Mr. Harold never charged us a penny, never asked for anything. He just did it because he saw a child who needed help. I stared at the photo, trying to reconcile this young man with the father I knew. What happened to him? Life happened, mija. Rosa's voice was sad but not bitter. He married your mother when he was 26. She came from money, real money, and I think he felt he had to prove himself worthy of her family. Then the recession hit in the late 70s, and her family lost almost everything. Your father felt responsible for saving them, for maintaining the lifestyle she'd grown up with. The pressure changed him. She explained how Lila had suffered severe postpartum depression after June's birth, requiring expensive treatment that insurance barely covered. How Harold's business had struggled during economic downturns. How the medical bills and the mortgage and the desperate need to keep up appearances had slowly crushed the idealistic young man she'd known. He wasn't born cruel, Ms. Hart. Life made him desperate, and desperation made him cruel. That doesn't excuse what he did to you, but it might help you understand. Rosa reached into her bag again and pulled out an old leather journal, its cover cracked and faded. I found this when I was cleaning their study 30 years ago, tucked behind some books. I kept it all this time thinking maybe one day it would matter. After seeing those videos, I think now is that day. I opened the journal with trembling hands. The first entry was dated 1978, written in my father's younger, more careful handwriting. I want to be a man who gives, not takes. I want to build something that helps people, not just enriches me. Today, I helped Rosa's son with his reading, and his smile when he finished a whole page by himself was worth more than any paycheck. I flipped through pages of similar entries, watching my father's idealism play out in small acts of kindness documented in blue ink. Then, near the end, the tone shifted. An entry from late 1980. The bills keep coming. Lila's medication costs more each month. Her parents look at me like I'm failing them, failing her. I don't know how to be good and survive at the same time. Maybe I can't be both. The entries stopped after that. I closed the journal and sat with the weight of what Rosa had shown me. My father hadn't been born a monster. He'd been a person who'd made choices. Bad choices, weak choices. Choices that had compounded over decades until they'd transformed him into someone unrecognizable from the young man in that photograph. Understanding this didn't erase the harm he'd caused me. It didn't make the pain less real or the years of dismissal less damaging. But it added a layer of tragic complexity to my anger, made it harder to hold on to the clean, simple narrative of villain and victim. He had choices, I said finally, my voice thick with tears I hadn't expected to shed. Every step of the way he chose wrong. We all face pressure, face desperation. Not everyone becomes cruel. Rosa nodded slowly, her lined face compassionate. Yes, mija, we all have choices. And he made terrible ones. But now he's trying to make different ones. I've seen him at the community kitchen on Sundays. I volunteer there too. He shows up, he works hard, he's kind to the people he serves. It's been 3 weeks and he hasn't missed a single day. I closed the diary and looked at this woman who'd kept pieces of my father's better self preserved for 3 decades, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. Why are you telling me this now? Why does it matter? Because hate is easy, mija. Understanding is hard. And you strike me as someone brave enough to choose the hard thing. Rosa stood, placing her hand gently over mine. The question isn't whether your father deserves forgiveness. The question is whether you want to spend the rest of your life carrying anger toward a man who's already destroyed by his own choices, or whether you want to see if the boy in that photograph is still in there somewhere, waiting for a chance to come back. I closed the diary, tears streaming down my face as I looked at the photo of my father at 24, before life had hardened him, before fear had poisoned him. He had a choice, I whispered to Rosa. We all do. Rosa nodded sadly, her eyes wise with years of watching people struggle with their own humanity. Yes, mija. And now he's making a different one. The question is, will you let him try? I sat with Rosa's question for days, turning it over in my mind as I worked on planning an event that had been forming in my thoughts since watching Martha's video. 6 weeks after the wedding that had blown apart my family, I sent invitations for what I called a family by choice dinner at the Grand Bell Hart. I invited everyone who'd shown me what real family looked like, hotel employees from all 3 properties. Foundation staff, the women from the community kitchen, Diane, who'd kept evidence of my father's sabotage, Dr. Patel, who'd treated my mother with such compassion, Richard, my accountant, who'd stood up in that ballroom with documentation of financial abuse. I invited June and Caleb, who were working 12-hour shifts at our satellite property and seemed to be discovering who they were beneath their parents' expectations. I did not invite Harold and Lila. The ballroom was set with round tables that encouraged conversation rather than hierarchy, elegant, without being ostentatious warm lighting that made everyone look softer and more beautiful. At the center of the main table, I placed a single empty chair. In front of it, a small brass placard engraved with 3 words, "Reserved for remorse." I didn't explain it to anyone, but I saw people notice it throughout the evening, saw them whisper to each other about its meaning. Some thought it was symbolic, a memorial to all the people who should have done better. Others whispered that it was for my father, though I'd neither confirmed nor denied that speculation. The dinner began with speeches that made my chest ache with gratitude. Rosa spoke about the power of chosen family and the courage it takes to love people who aren't bound to you by obligation. Maya, the young server, talked about working for someone who saw her as a whole person rather than just a function. Thomas gave a toast to Martha Bell's legacy, and we played a video tribute I'd compiled from old footage and photographs, watching her transform from young entrepreneur to the wise woman who'd shaped my life from the shadows. June stood and spoke without notes, her voice breaking as she described learning what real family meant by watching me build it deliberately and carefully over years. The evening was joyful in a way I hadn't experienced before, full of laughter and genuine warmth. People from different worlds brought together by shared values rather than shared blood. But that empty chair remained visible throughout a silent question mark in the center of the celebration, and I found my eyes drawn to it repeatedly, as if expecting it to answer some question I hadn't fully formed. We were midway through dessert when the ballroom doors opened. The sound of them swinging inward carried across the conversation, and heads turned toward the entrance. Harold stood in the doorway, holding his hat in both hands, like a supplicant approaching a throne. He'd lost weight since I'd last seen him, his expensive suit hanging loose on a diminished frame, and his face had the hollowed look of someone who hadn't been sleeping. Behind him, partially obscured, stood my mother, leaning slightly on a cane I'd never seen her use before her illness and shame, having stripped away the imperious bearing she'd worn like armor my entire life. The ballroom fell completely silent. 200 conversations stopped mid-sentence as everyone turned to look at this man who'd become infamous through viral videos and social media dissection. Harold didn't move from the doorway. He didn't speak or make demands or try to justify his presence. He simply stood there, his eyes finding the empty chair, then finding me, a question written in the lines of his exhausted face that he didn't have the presumption to voice aloud. I felt the room tense around me. Several staff members stood, their body language protective, positioning themselves as if to block him from entering. Rosa reached across the table to touch my hand, and I saw in her face both understanding and concern. The choice was mine, and everyone in that room knew it. Harold had no right to be here, had earned no place at this table, and no one would have blamed me for asking him to leave. I stood slowly and raised my hand in a small gesture that somehow communicated to the protective circle around me that it was okay that I had this. The room remained silent as I walked across the distance between my table and the doorway where my father stood. We faced each other for a long moment, close enough that I could see the tears gathering in his eyes, could see the genuine brokenness in his expression that might have been performance, but felt in this moment like truth. I didn't speak. Instead, I turned and looked at the empty chair, then back at him and gave a small nod. Permission, not absolution. An invitation, not forgiveness. Harold's face crumpled and fresh tears spilled down his cheeks as he walked slowly into the ballroom, his steps measured and careful as if the floor might give way beneath him. Every eye tracked his progress as he made his way to that empty chair and lowered himself into it with a carefulness that suggested he understood how fragile this moment was, how easily it could shatter. My mother remained by the door, understanding without being told that she had not been invited to enter, that whatever redemption might be available to my father in this moment was his alone to claim or squander. Harold sat in the chair marked "Reserved for Remorse," his hands folded in his lap like a penitent child awaiting judgment. The entire ballroom watched in absolute silence. Then I picked up a pitcher of water from the nearest table and walked toward him. I stood before my father with the pitcher of water in one hand, and with the other I reached for an empty plate from the nearby table. The room held its collective breath as I placed the plate in front of him, the ceramic settling onto the wood with a soft clink that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Harold looked down at the empty plate, then up at me, confusion and hope warring in his expression. "In this house everyone serves themselves," I said, my voice clear enough to carry across the ballroom. "No one is handed anything, not even redemption." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by something that looked like respect. He stood slowly, his movements careful, and walked toward the buffet line that had been set up along the far wall. I watched him take his place behind Maya, behind Thomas, behind two housekeepers whose names he'd never bothered to learn. He waited his turn like everyone else, no special treatment, no shortcuts. And when he reached the serving dishes, he took modest portions with hands that shook slightly. He returned to the empty chair and sat the plate of food in front of him, but he didn't reach for his fork. His eyes found mine across the table, asking permission he had no right to expect, but was humble enough to request anyway. I sat down across from him, folding my hands on the table. "You can eat, Dad. You're here now." He ate slowly, mechanically, and I could see tears tracking down his face with each bite. The conversations around us had resumed in hushed tones, people giving us space while remaining acutely aware of what was happening at the center of the room. When Harold had finished, he set down his fork and sat in silence for a long moment. Then, without any prompting from me, he stood again. "May I say something?" His voice was hoarse, directed at me, but loud enough for others to hear. I nodded, and he turned to address the room, his hands gripping the back of the chair as if he needed it for physical support. "My name is Harold Hart. Most of you know who I am and what I've done. The videos are everywhere, and they tell the truth about me in ways I spent decades hiding." He paused, gathering himself. "I came here tonight not to ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and I'm not foolish enough to think a single dinner can erase 38 years of cruelty. I came to bear witness to what real family looks like because I never built one myself despite having every chance to do so." His voice cracked, but he pushed forward. "For 38 years, I had a daughter who gave me everything. She saved my home, paid for my other daughter's education, funded the lifestyle I was too proud to admit I couldn't afford, and I gave her nothing but pain in return. I told myself I was protecting my family, protecting our image, protecting June's happiness. The truth is, I was protecting my pride, my ego, my desperate need to feel important despite knowing I wasn't." He looked directly at me, and the rawness in his face was almost painful to witness. "You didn't just build a business, Evelyn. You built a family based on respect and dignity and genuine care for people. You did what I never could, what I was too small and scared to even attempt. I'm here to learn from you if you'll let me, and if you won't, I understand that too." The room remained silent as he finished speaking. Every eye turned to me, waiting to see how I would respond to this public confession. I stood and walked around the table to where my father stood, trembling, and for a moment I let the tension build, let everyone wonder what I would do. Then I extended my hand. "You have 1 year," I said quietly but firmly. "Prove it's not just words." Harold took my hand in both of his and shook it while weeping openly, his shoulders shaking with the force of his emotion. It wasn't forgiveness, and everyone in that room understood that. It was something more complex, a chance conditional and fragile to become someone different than who he'd been. I released his hand and walked to the ballroom entrance where my mother still stood, leaning heavily on her cane, her face wet with tears. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, diminished by illness and shame in equal measure. "I don't deserve to come in," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know I don't." "No, you don't," I agreed, and I saw her flinch. "But neither did I, according to you. Yet here we are." I offered her my arm, and after a moment of hesitation, she took it, her grip weak but present. I helped her across the ballroom to an empty seat at the main table, and she sat down heavily, her eyes taking in the faces of people she'd once dismissed as beneath her notice. Rosa, the head cook who'd prayed for me in the kitchen and who'd brought me my father's diary, approached with a plate of food. She set it in front of my mother with a gentle firmness. "You look hungry, señora. Eat." That simple act of service offered by someone my mother had treated with contempt broke something fundamental in Lila. She began to sob quietly, her hands covering her face, and Rosa stood beside her for a moment with one hand on her shoulder before returning to her own seat. Dessert was being served, small portions of chocolate torte with fresh berries, when Harold looked across the table at me with eyes still red and swollen from crying. "Do you think it's too late for me to become the man I should have been?" I set down the water pitcher I'd been holding, thinking about Rosa's photo of my young father teaching her son to read about Martha's message, that grace isn't about forgetting, but about choosing peace, about the empty chair that had been waiting all evening for someone brave enough to sit in it. We'll see. 6 months passed with the kind of slow, unspectacular change that actually lasts. The Lila Grace Fund, which had started as a symbolic gesture toward redemption, raised over $400,000 in its first half year of operation. 47 cancer patients from working-class backgrounds received treatment they couldn't have afforded otherwise, and the local news ran a feature story that focused not on the scandal that birthed the fund, but on the lives it had saved. My mother, whose cancer was now in remission according to her latest scans, began volunteering at the oncology center where she'd received treatment. I heard from Dr. Patel that patients responded to her in unexpected ways, relating to her story of falling from grace and finding humility through illness. Lila wasn't the imperious society woman anymore. She was just another person who'd faced mortality and come out changed. Harold had completed 6 months of Sunday service at the Bellhart Community Kitchen without missing a single week. I stopped by unannounced one Sunday in late March and watched him from the doorway serving plates to a line of people who probably had no idea who he was or what he'd done. He was still awkward in some ways, his movements careful and deliberate, but there was none of the stiffness I'd seen in those first weeks. An elderly veteran named Frank, a regular who I recognized from other visits, sat at one of the tables and waved Harold over after the serving line cleared. I watched my father sit across from this man and listen with genuine attention as Frank told some story that involved animated hand gestures. Later, Rosa told me that Harold and Frank had developed a real friendship, that Harold asked questions about Frank's experiences with homelessness and systemic poverty, actually absorbing answers instead of dismissing them. He was learning slowly about all the privilege he'd wasted being afraid of not having enough. June and Caleb had been managing the Bellhart property in the neighboring city of Greenfield for 4 months, and the transformation in my sister was remarkable. She'd started at the front desk, despite having no experience taking angry calls and dealing with difficult guests, and learning the 1,000 small details that make hospitality work. The employees there knew she was my sister, but they respected her because she showed up early, stayed late, and never asked anyone to do work she wasn't willing to do herself. She'd lost contact with most of her country club friends, the ones who'd only valued her for her parents' connections and her willingness to fund their lifestyle. But she'd gained real friendships with coworkers, people who invited her to barbecues and baby showers, and knew her as June, the assistant manager, rather than June, the society princess. Her marriage to Caleb had deepened, built now on shared values and genuine partnership rather than the performance of a perfect life. I decided it was time to host what I was calling the first Hart family dinner, and I deliberately chose to hold it at my own home rather than a restaurant or hotel. This was the first time I'd invited my parents into my personal space, and that fact wasn't lost on anyone. The gathering was small me, June, Caleb, Harold, Lila, and Diane, who'd become something like family to me over the past months. My father arrived with flowers, simple daisies rather than the elaborate arrangements he used to favor, and my mother brought a stack of handwritten thank you notes she'd written to various Bellhart staff members, asking if I would distribute them. I'd cooked the meal myself, nothing fancy, just roasted chicken and vegetables and a salad, and we ate at my small dining table with mismatched chairs that I'd collected over years. The conversation was awkward at first, stilted with the weight of everything unsaid, but gradually it found a rhythm. Harold talked about Frank and what he was learning at the community kitchen. Lila shared about a patient at the oncology center who reminded her of herself at a younger age. June described a particularly difficult guest situation she'd handled successfully. There were apologies woven through the updates, small acknowledgments of past harm that didn't demand immediate absolution, and once or twice there was even genuine laughter. As we were finishing the meal, my mother reached across the table toward me and said, "Could you pass the salt, honey?" The endearment came out automatically, a habit from some version of our relationship that had never actually existed, and I saw her register what she'd said. Her hand froze mid-reach and her face colored. "I'm sorry. Is it okay if I call you that?" I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who'd caused me so much pain and was now asking permission for a kindness she'd never earned. "Earn it first," I said quietly. "Then we'll see." It wasn't cruel, just boundaried, a statement of fact about where we stood. Harold, who was watching this exchange, nodded almost imperceptibly. He understood now that consequences weren't punishments, but natural outcomes that trust had to be rebuilt through consistent action over time. June squeezed my hand under the table, a silent gesture of support that warmed me more than any endearment could have. After dinner, we cleared the dishes together, all of us carrying plates to the kitchen and finding roles in the cleanup. Harold stood at my sink drying dishes with a dish towel, something I would never have imagined seeing 6 months ago, while June washed and Caleb put things away. Lila, still weak from treatment, sat at the kitchen table folding the cloth napkins I'd used, contributing what she could. As Harold dried the last plate, my mother stood and moved to the window that looked out over my small backyard. "Look," she whispered, and we all turned to see what had caught her attention. Outside, the sunset painted everything gold. "Maybe there's still time for beauty," she said, her voice carrying a hope that sounded both fragile and genuine. I walked to stand beside her at the window, looking at the same golden light. Maybe, but beauty without truth is just another lie. 1 year after the wedding that had become infamous across social media and local news, I decided to host an anniversary dinner in the same ballroom where everything had fallen apart. But the energy was entirely different this time. Instead of 200 society guests dressed in their finest to witness a performance of family perfection, I invited about 100 people who'd been part of the rebuilding hotel staff from all 3 properties. Foundation beneficiaries who'd found their footing after family estrangement. June and Caleb, who were now thriving as managers. Harold and Lila, who'd spent a year earning back fragments of trust. Diane, who'd been my guardian when I needed one. Rosa, who'd shown me my father's better self, and the Morrison family who'd chosen compassion over social alliance. The tables were set simply but warmly intimate rather than ostentatious, a celebration of what we'd built from wreckage, rather than a display of what we wanted people to believe we were. I stood to speak as dinner was being served, and the room quieted with an ease that comes from genuine respect rather than obligatory attention. A year ago in this room, my family fell apart in front of everyone. Tonight I want to show you what we built from the pieces. I gestured to the projection screen, which began playing a video compilation I'd worked on for weeks. It showed testimonials from participants in the Second Families Initiative, young adults who'd found belonging after biological family rejection. They talked about chosen family, about learning that love is something you do rather than something you're entitled to by blood. By the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, including my own. The theme that emerged from every story was the same family is a verb, not a noun. It's what you do, not what you're born into. When the video ended, my mother stood. She'd been in remission for 4 months, now had gained back the weight she'd lost during treatment, and looked healthier than I'd seen her in years. But it was the expression on her face that was most changed, stripped of the desperate need for external validation that had driven her my entire life. She pulled out a folded piece of paper and read from it, her voice steady despite obvious emotion. To every staff member I disrespected, every person I looked down upon, every moment I chose status over humanity, I am deeply sorry. I spent 40 years trying to be someone I wasn't. Someone I thought I needed to be to matter. My daughter taught me it's never too late to become someone real. She announced that she'd established a scholarship for the children of hospitality workers funded by selling her country club membership. The applause that followed was warm and genuine, and I saw tears streaming down her face as she sat back down. My father didn't give a speech, but he approached the front of the room carrying something wrapped in brown paper. He unwrapped it to reveal a large framed photo collage titled "The Real Hart Family" in simple lettering. The images included me with hotel staff at various events, Martha Bell holding me as an infant, June working the front desk with genuine concentration on her face, Harold in his community kitchen apron serving meals, Lila sitting with cancer patients at the oncology center. At the center was a photo from one of our recent family dinners, all of us around my small table smiling in a way that looked unrehearsed and true. A note card was attached to the frame in my father's handwriting. I'm sorry I couldn't see this family when it mattered. Thank you for letting me see it now. He hung the collage on the wall near the entrance where everyone would see it, a permanent installation, acknowledging what was real rather than what we'd pretended to be. As dinner wound down and people began standing to mingle and say their goodbyes, I walked to where the empty chair still sat, the one that had been marked "reserved for remorse" 6 months ago. I'd kept it as a permanent fixture, but tonight I removed that placard and replaced it with a new one I'd had made. "Reserved for anyone who needs a seat." The chair remained empty as I placed the new sign, but its meaning had shifted entirely. It was no longer about punishment or penance. It was an invitation, a promise that there would always be room for people seeking redemption, seeking family, seeking a place to belong. I stood looking at that chair when I felt someone approach behind me. My father stepped forward quietly and placed a small piece of folded paper on the seat, then stepped back without speaking. I picked it up and unfolded it to read his handwriting. "I'm sorry. Thank you for teaching me grace." "Dad." I read it twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. I didn't say anything, just turned and gestured toward a nearby table where food still remained an invitation without words. Harold sat, and I poured tea for both of us from a pot that had been left on the table. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint gold across the ballroom windows, and gradually others joined us. June appeared with Caleb, then my mother moving slowly but steadily without her cane, then Rosa and Diane, then a few staff members who felt comfortable enough to sit with the owner. The table filled naturally, organically, not through any forced arrangement, but through genuine desire to be together. Someone told a story that made everyone laugh. Someone else passed bread around the table. The conversation flowed with the ease of people who'd done hard work to get here and knew the value of what they'd built. It wasn't perfect. My relationship with my parents would probably never be uncomplicated, would always carry the weight of those 38 years when I'd been made to feel invisible. Some wounds don't fully close, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But sitting there as the evening light softened into dusk, I felt something I'd never expected to feel with them: peace. Not the peace of forgetting or pretending the past didn't happen, but the peace of choosing not to let that past consume my present. I lifted my teacup and looked around the table at faces that had once been full of judgment, performance, and desperate grasping at status, now showing effort and hope and the tentative beginnings of something genuine. My father met my eyes with gratitude. My mother's expression held humility I'd never seen before. June squeezed my free hand. I didn't make a toast or a proclamation, didn't try to wrap everything up with a neat bow or pretend we'd arrived at some final destination. I simply said the words that had started this whole journey a year ago, words that had meant confrontation then, but meant invitation now. Dinner's served. And that's where Evie's story ends, at least for now. A year of transformation, a year of pain turned into power, and ultimately a year of choosing grace over vengeance. Sitting at that table with her family, imperfect and still healing, Evie had finally found what she'd been searching for her entire life. Not the approval of people who'd never valued her, but peace with herself and boundaries that protected her dignity. This story reminds us that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes the people who see us most clearly, who stand by us when we're invisible to everyone else, are the ones we choose. Martha Bell chose Evie. The hotel staff chose Evie. Diane chose Evie. And eventually, Evie chose herself. That's the most important choice of all. But here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever been the practical one, the one expected to give without receiving, the one whose achievements were minimized to protect someone else's feelings? Drop a comment below and share your story. You're not alone, and your experience matters. And if Evie's journey resonated with you, if you found yourself rooting for her, or crying with her, or feeling that surge of satisfaction when Harold's hot mic moment exposed the truth, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. These are real stories about real people facing real challenges, and they deserve to be heard. What do you think about how Evie handled everything? Did she go too far or not far enough? Should she have forgiven her parents sooner, or were her boundaries exactly what they needed? I'm genuinely curious about your perspective because these questions don't have easy answers. Life is complicated, families are messy, and sometimes the right choice is the one that lets you sleep at night with your dignity intact. Thank you for listening to Evie's story all the way to the end. Remember, you deserve a seat at the table, not in the kitchen. And if the people in your life can't see that, maybe it's time to build a new table. Until next time, dinner's served.